ኢትዮጵያ ቻናል ላይ ታገኙናላችሁ። በራዲዮ በ9310 ኪሎ ሄርትዝ በ11720 ኪሎ ሄርትዝ እና በ15660 ኪሎ ሄርትዝ ላይ ታገኙናላችሁ። የአሜሪካ ድምጽ
ክቡራት ተኸታተልትና ሎሚ ባይቶ ጸጥታ ሕብረት ሃገራት ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ምልክቱ ዘካየደ ዘሎ ርክብ ብቐጥታ ክንፍኖ ኢና መዛረብ ብዛዕባ ናይቲ ባይቶ ጸጥታ ሕብረት ሃገራት ዘካየዱ ኣኼባ ኢትዮጵያ ንሸውዓተ ሰራሕተኛታት ትካል ኣመልኪታ ዝገበረቶ ናይ ምውፃእ ስጉምቲ እዩ ነዚ መደብ ብቐጥታ ንምክትታል ኣብ ቴሌቭዥን በትልሙድ መስመራትና ኢትዮሳት ከምኡ ናይ ቪኦኤ መስመር ምክትታል ይከኣል ብሬድዮ ድማ 9310 11720 كمون 15660 كيلو هرتز مكسعة بكال بدحان مسو
أركفوني وردفتوتا كينيا وردفتوتا سجلي أمريكا سجلين أمريكا mana mare mootummoota gamtoomanii keessatti walgahii dhimma Itoophiyaa ilaalchisee taasifamaa jiru amma jalqabee kallattiidhaan isinii dabarsa sagantaa kana kan isinii nu hordofuu dandeessanu karaa raadiyootiin meetir baandii 9,000 yookaan kiiloo heerzii 9,000 310 irratti yookaan immoo kiiloo heerzii 11,720 akkasumas kiiloo heerzii 15,660 irratti argachuu hin dandeessu. Walga'iin kun kan godhamaa jiru akkuma yaadatamu torban darbe mootummaan Itoophiyaa hojjettoota gargaarsaa mootummoota gamtoomanii torba biyya akka bahanu godhee ture. Kana irratti barreessaan mootummoota gamtoomanii ibsa kennu. Ibsa kana irrattis immoo marii hin taasifama akkuma kanatti qophii kana alkan keessa amma gara saatii 4 ta'a biyya keessatti saatii kanarraa jalqabne kallattiidhaan isinii dabarsinaa jechuudha.
ክቡራትና ክቡራን አድማጮች በድጋሚ እንደምናመሻችሁ ከአሜሪካ ድምጽ ከዋሽንግተን ዲሲ ነው ይህንን ዝግጅት ይዘንላችሁ የቀረብ ነው። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ላይ ለመነጋገር አሁን እየተሰበሰበ ነው ያለው። በጥቂት ደቂቃዎች ውስጥ ውይይቱ ይጀመራል ተብሎ ይጠበቃል። እየተሰበሰቡ ናቸው እንደምትመለከቱት የምክር ቤቱ አባላት። ይህንን ስርጭት በራዲዮ በ9310 በ11720 እና በ15660 ኪሎ ሄርትዝ በቀጥታ መከታተል ማዳመጥ ትችላላችሁ። የእንደራሴዎቹን ወይም ይቅርታ የአምባሳደሮቹን ንግግሮች በቴሌቪዥንና በራዲዮ በቴሌቪዥን የምትከታተሉን ተመልካቾቻችን ደግሞ በመደበኛው ቪኦኤ ኢትዮጵያ ቻናል በኢትዮሳት ታገኙናላችሁ። ኢትዮጵያ የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት 7 ባለስልጣናትን በቅርቡ ከሀገር እንዲወጡ ካዘዘች በኋላ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ ሁኔታው እርምጃው እንዳስደነገጣቸው በመግለጽ ይህንኑ አቋሟን ወይም ውሳኔዋን ኢትዮጵያ እንድታጥፍ ለማድረግ ጥረት እንደሚያደርጉ ተናግረው ነበር። ስብሰባው ወደ መጀመሩ ነው። በቀጥታ ወደ ማስተላለፍ እንሄዳለን። ፕሬዚደንቱ የኬንያ አምባሳደር ናቸው። ወደዛው እንለፍ።
The provisional agenda for this meeting is peace and security in Africa. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ethiopia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I welcome this opportunity to brief you concerning the situation in Ethiopia. In August, I warned the Council that a humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding before our eyes in Ethiopia, and since then, the crisis has worsened. Up to 7 million people in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar are now in need of food assistance and other emergency support. This includes more than 5 million people in Tigray, where an estimated 400,000 are living in famine-like conditions. Humanitarian aid is still not reaching the area at anywhere close to the levels needed. The only option for road transportation into Tigray is along the Afar corridor, where movements are being severely restricted by official and unofficial checkpoints, insecurity, and other obstacles and challenges. Some minor improvements that are welcome did not change the fundamental nature of the problem. Vital food supplies continue to be blocked, as are essential medicines and equipment. Humanitarian organizations continue to lack the cash they need to operate and to pay their staff. Access to electricity remains precarious. Millions of people are cut off from communication networks and vital services such as health care. And fighting in Amhara is another serious impediment to humanitarian access. As a result of all these facts, life-saving humanitarian operations are being crippled. Our colleagues on the ground are sharing increasingly alarming eyewitness testimony of the suffering, including growing accounts of hunger-related deaths. And in locations where screening has been possible, we are seeing acute malnutrition rates that remind us of the onset of the 2011 Somalia famine. We are also seeing deeply worrying reports of violations of human rights abuses perpetrated by all sides. I am particularly concerned about chilling accounts of violence against women and children, including sexual and gender-based violence. Mr. President, the UN is also actively engaged in humanitarian support to other regions of Ethiopia with pressing needs. The country is facing an immense humanitarian crisis that demands immediate attention. All efforts should be squarely focused on saving lives and avoiding a massive human tragedy. This makes last Thursday's announcement by the government of Ethiopia to expel 7 senior UN officials, most of them humanitarian staff, particularly disturbing. This unprecedented expulsion should be a matter of deep concern for us all, as it relates to the core of relations between the UN and member states. As expressed in the Note Verbal to the Mission of Ethiopia from the Office of Legal Affairs and shared with the Council a few days ago, and I quote, "A declaration by a state that an official of the United Nations is persona non grata, accompanied by a request or demand that the Secretary General consequently relocate that official out of its territory, is not consistent with the Charter obligation and is inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the International Civil Service enshrined in the Charter. The procedure on such matters is clear. As the Note Verbal states, if the government has any specific issues concerning any individuals, the relevant information should be brought to the attention of the United Nations to enable the Secretary General to make a decision as to whether any appropriate actions should be taken. In other words, there is a proper, formal procedure, and that procedure was not followed. The United Nations will continue to play its mandated role and work with the government of Ethiopia and with local and international partners to support millions of people in need of humanitarian assistance in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, and across the country, in full accordance with UN Charter and General Assembly Resolution 46/182. I now call on Ethiopian authorities to allow us to do without hindrance and to facilitate and enable our work with the urgency that this situation demands. This means ensuring that visas for incoming personnel from UN entities and from our partners are issued quickly so that we can augment our capacity. The delays we have witnessed in the recent past are another obstacle to effective humanitarian aid. It also means that personnel inside the country are treated with dignity and respect as they carry out their vital work. Our focus remains on ensuring humanitarian assistance to every Ethiopian who needs it. We must save lives and restore livelihoods. I urge the government to allow the unrestricted movement of desperately needed fuel, cash, communications equipment, and humanitarian supplies into all the regions in need. And I appeal to all members of the Security Council to do all they can to support these calls and to unify behind the efforts of the United Nations and its partners in Ethiopia. Last August, in this Council, I called for action on several fronts. As I said then, and I quote, "All parties must immediately end hostilities without preconditions and seize that opportunity to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Foreign forces should leave the country. Unrestricted humanitarian access to all areas in need must be guaranteed, and humanitarian workers must be respected. Public services must be re-established." This appeal is even more pressing today. Any further escalation of the conflict would only make the situation more tragic. Mr. President, important political events have taken place in Ethiopia since my last Security Council briefing in August. Just 2 days ago, a new government of Ethiopia, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has inaugurated. The mandate conferred by the election carries a responsibility to unite all Ethiopians, to focus on the future, to return Ethiopia to its place as a strong, unified, stable leader among the nations of the world. I encourage the newly inaugurated government to use this mandate and work with renewed determination to be a government for all. I welcome the Prime Minister's inauguration remarks prioritizing an inclusive political dialogue involving all segments of the community to resolve the ongoing challenges facing the country. I also note the many messages from African heads of state emphasizing the need for harmony, national unity, development, and peace. I urge all sides to grasp the peace initiative from the AU and his High Representative for the Horn of Africa, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo. Without peace, the challenges facing Ethiopia will intensify and further destabilize the broader Horn of Africa region and beyond. We have an obligation to avoid such a dire outcome at all costs. Mr. President, dialogue is the foundation for peace, and peace is the foundation for a stable and prosperous future. Let us all work to help secure that future for all Ethiopians and for the peoples of the region, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your important and timely briefing today. Ireland joined with others in calling this meeting because we believe that the recent expulsion of UN leadership from Ethiopia should be addressed publicly by this Council. This expulsion is particularly egregious in the context of the continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia. It cannot be excused nor ignored. Last Friday, Martin Griffiths told us that 5.2 million people require humanitarian assistance and 400,000 are living in famine-like conditions in Tigray. 80% of pregnant and lactating women are acutely malnourished. Perhaps most worryingly, child malnutrition rates are similar to those recorded at the onset of the Somalia famine in 2011. Let's be clear about what this means. Ethiopian children are starving. People are dying because they cannot access food, water, and basic health care. This is not a situation caused by natural disaster. It's caused by those who continue to choose the path of war. The ongoing effective blockade of Tigray including systematic efforts to prevent medicines and medical supplies from reaching the region, is costing lives. As the conflict spills over into neighbouring Amhara and Afar regions, the humanitarian crisis is spreading. In these circumstances, we need a fully operational, unimpeded and proportionate humanitarian response, reaching all those in need of assistance and protection in northern Ethiopia and across the country. The decision of the Ethiopian government to expel senior UN staff undermines its working relationship with the UN when it needs it most. As outlined by the EU High Representative on Monday, it risks the further weakening of efforts to bring relief to millions of Ethiopians in need at a moment when aid organisations already face serious impediments in carrying out their mandates. Unfounded allegations and consistent targeting of humanitarian workers put all humanitarian work in a country at risk and are unacceptable. Safeguarding the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality and independence ensures that aid can arrive where and when it is needed most. As others around this table have previously done, I call on all parties to the conflict to depoliticise humanitarian aid. Secretary General, you made clear to us when we last met and in your recent letter that the conflict in Ethiopia is spiralling out of control. We were warned of this months ago. Ireland, a long-standing friend of Ethiopia, has been drawing attention to this and its inevitable consequences for the people of Ethiopia since we joined the Council. We ended our last meeting with you, Secretary General, in agreement that quiet diplomacy should be given a chance. Despite such efforts, we continue to receive reports of inflammatory, dehumanising language. As you said today, Secretary General, any further escalation would only make the situation more tragic. We continue to receive reports of conflict-related sexual violence and atrocities, denial of access to humanitarian aid, and attacks on humanitarian workers which may amount to war crimes. Those who commit such violations must be held accountable. Before we see the tragedy worsen even further, before we see more young people needlessly lose their lives to this war, all sides must accept there can be no military solution to the crisis. Mr. President, let me reiterate the three key asks of many of us here at this table. First, we are asking all parties to the conflict to immediately ensure full, unimpeded and safe humanitarian access required in accordance with international humanitarian law. The blockade on Tigray must end now. The basic services must be restored. Food, medicines and fuel cannot be restricted to just a fraction of what is required. Without immediate and scaled-up action, the horror of mass mortality caused by political decisions, once again, will tragically overwhelm parts of Ethiopia. Second, we all want to see an immediate cessation of hostilities between all parties to the conflict and for them to come to the table to negotiate a lasting ceasefire. Eritrean forces also need to withdraw from Ethiopia. And third, we need a political solution to the crisis in Tigray, as well as an Ethiopian-led inclusive national dialogue that promotes the unity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the African Union has a crucial role to play in engaging with all sides, supporting mediation efforts and ultimately assisting Ethiopia in finding a solution to this crisis. Ireland looks forward to hearing an update from the AU High Representative Obasanjo at the next available opportunity. To conclude, Mr. President, Ethiopia's government has a historic opportunity and indeed a new mandate to turn the tide towards peace and to steer the country back onto the hopeful path of just a few years ago. We are approaching the one-year anniversary of this conflict. It must end. It's time for Ethiopia's leaders to deliver the peace, unity and prosperity which all Ethiopian people deserve. The alternative is catastrophic, prolonged and expanding conflict that threatens to destroy Ethiopia's ambition for a prosperous and peaceful future. We simply cannot afford to miss this opportunity. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your briefing. We wholeheartedly support the statement you made today, last Thursday, and also your letter sent to the Security Council on this matter. Estonia strongly condemns the decision of the government of Ethiopia to expel 7 UN officials, including humanitarian and human rights officials. These personnel were responsible for the invaluable and difficult work of delivering life-saving aid to Ethiopia and helping the Ethiopian people with the unfolding man-made humanitarian catastrophe. It is essential that UN humanitarian operations are immediately allowed to resume in full capacity in Ethiopia. UN humanitarian operations are guided by the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence, and they have our full confidence. Any accusations against UN workers and humanitarian personnel of breaches of these principles should be accompanied by clear evidence. There is a process for handling any such concerns, and this has not been followed. The expulsion of the UN officials from Ethiopia undermines the efforts to alleviate the dire humanitarian situation and further endangers the work of humanitarian aid workers in northern Ethiopia, where they are already facing violence and harassment. Mr. President, all parties to the conflict have an obligation to facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all areas affected by conflict and ensure the protection of humanitarian workers in line with international humanitarian law. We urge the government of Ethiopia to take further steps to ensure sustained access for aid convoys to Tigray, to restore public services in the region, and to allow food, fuel, and medical supplies to enter. Only 11% of needed aid entering the region is not acceptable. At the same time, we call upon the Tigray forces to stop their offensive in neighboring Amhara and Afar regions and to facilitate humanitarian assistance to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. Furthermore, we underline the importance of concluding the joint investigation into the allegations of human rights violations and abuses, in particular against human rights workers. The continued reports of these violations and abuses of international humanitarian law and international human rights are deeply worrying, and accountability for these violations must be ensured. Finally, I reiterate that there is no military solution in Tigray. The newly appointed cabinet in Ethiopia has a mandate from the people and an obligation to bring about a prompt and peaceful solution to the conflict, and also ensure that people of Ethiopia do not die of hunger. I urge the parties to immediately cease hostilities, ensure protection of civilians, and minimize the humanitarian consequences of the ongoing conflict. This should be followed by an inclusive and credible political process with the aim of national reconciliation. In this context, we also reiterate the role of the African Union and encourage their continued engagement in this crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President,
Je remercie tout d'abord le secrétaire général pour sa présence aujourd'hui parmi nous et pour son intervention. Je tiens à saluer l'engagement du personnel des Nations Unies déployé en Éthiopie. Face à l'urgence humanitaire, la France attend des autorités éthiopiennes une pleine coopération avec les Nations Unies et avec l'ensemble des partenaires internationaux. Elle condamne la décision du gouvernement éthiopien de déclarer 7 personnels des Nations Unies persona non grata. La France et l'Union européenne continueront à soutenir les populations civiles durement touchées par le conflit, gravely affected by the conflict. Leur contribution financière à la réponse humanitaire dans le nord du pays, ainsi que le pont aérien mis en place par l'Union européenne, la France et l'Italie. Ce soutien implique que les personnels des Nations Unies et l'ensemble des acteurs humanitaires puissent travailler en toute sécurité et dans le plein respect des principes et du droit humanitaire. La France appelle les autorités éthiopiennes à garantir un plein accès pour l'ensemble du personnel humanitaire et à respecter leurs propres engagements. Nous ne tolérerons ni intimidation, ni violence contre le personnel humanitaire. La levée du blocus en place est un préalable à toute résolution du conflit en cours. Ici comme ailleurs, seule une solution politique permettra de sortir de la crise. La France soutient pleinement les 3 points rappelés aujourd'hui par vous, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général. Un cessez-le-feu est indispensable pour répondre à l'urgence et créer les conditions d'un règlement. La France appelle de nouveau au retrait des forces érythréennes du territoire éthiopien, en particulier du Tigré de l'Ouest. En retour, nous appelons les forces tigréennes à donner des gages de sincérité et à réintégrer les frontières régionales du Tigré. Il est enfin important qu'un compromis soit trouvé avec les forces Amhara sur le différend frontalier entre les deux régions dans le cadre de la Constitution. La réconciliation ne pourra s'effectuer
Reconciliation is only possible if they fight against impunity. France is looking forward to the publication planned for the 1st of November of the report of the joint inquiry led by the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights. We take note of the commitments made by the Ethiopian government to identify and prosecute those responsible for human rights violations. France will support all efforts for dialogue which seek to preserve the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We take note of the commitment of the Prime Minister to organize an inclusive national dialogue, and we call on him to launch this as soon as possible. France also supports the efforts of President Obasanjo, who will be received tomorrow in Paris. We encourage all international actors, starting with the United Nations, to provide all the support needed for his work to succeed. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the representative of France for his statement.
ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ ራዲዮ ጣቢያ የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤትን ስብሰባ ነው እየተከታተላችሁ ያላችሁት።
On Friday, we were shocked by Ethiopia's expulsion of 7 UN officials. And today, we are profoundly dismayed by Ethiopia's failure to reverse this untenable decision. The man-made humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia is getting worse by the day, and famine has, most probably, already taken hold. In this context, the expulsion of essential UN officials, key humanitarian leaders, is deeply disturbing. President, it is unacceptable that Ethiopia chooses to obstruct the important work of crucial UN organizations. The UN is delivering life-saving aid to people in desperate need, impartially and in all parts of Ethiopia. The UN is not a party to the conflict in Ethiopia. On the contrary, Norway firmly believes in the impartiality and professionalism of the UN and its personnel. We are steadfast in our support of the UN and wish to reiterate our request that Ethiopia immediately reverse the expulsion of 7 staff members. President, to end the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Tigray, the federal Ethiopian authorities, the TPLF, and other armed actors must ensure rapid, safe, and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the region. They must do their utmost to facilitate the work of humanitarian organizations and their personnel, and fully respect international humanitarian law by providing security for humanitarian workers. We deplore the ongoing vilifying comments made regarding humanitarian actors. Such hateful rhetoric is dangerous and is putting lives at risk. This situation hit those already vulnerable the hardest, including those facing famine, those displaced, and more often than not, women and children. Indeed, the denial of humanitarian access during conflict is one of the 6 grave violations against children. There must be a response to this. Norway also condemns in the strongest term the reported killings of civilians and the widespread and systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. All alleged atrocities and violations by all sides must be documented and investigated. Accountability for such acts is critical for prevention, deterrence, and justice for victims and survivors. President, Norway strongly supports the appointment of former President Obasanjo as the AU High Representative on the Horn of Africa, and we ask the parties to actively engage with the High Representative. This Council, at a bare minimum, should be clear in support of his endeavors and unified in its support for the United Nations, its humanitarian agencies, and UN staff. If we cannot do this, we have failed. We must urgently and with one voice speak out in support of this, together with an immediate ceasefire, a political dialogue, unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need, and an immediate reversal of the expulsion of the 7 UN officials. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
ክቡራት ተኸታተልትና ትሰምዑ ዘለኹም ሬድዮ ድምፂ ኣሜሪካ እዩ እዚ ብቐጥታ ዝመሓለፍ ዘሎ መደብ ባይቶ ፀጥታ ሕብራት ሃገራት ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ኣመልኪቱ ዝህቦ ዘሎ ገምጋሚ እዩ ተኸታተሉና
I start by paying tribute to UN staff around the world who work tirelessly to deliver humanitarian aid, assessing and addressing needs on a neutral, impartial basis. I think we all agree that their life-saving activities should not be politicised, and that Member States should make every effort to support and facilitate their work. That is why the United Kingdom, like many of Ethiopia's partners, was deeply disappointed by the government of Ethiopia's decision to expel 7 UN officials. The strength of international concern about this is apparent in the fact that over 40 countries quickly joined a joint statement delivered by the United Kingdom at the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the 4th of October. Mr. President, as we have heard and seen, the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia is critical. The UN personnel who were expelled were dealing with the increasingly acute needs of those in the north of Ethiopia. The UK Special Envoy for Famine Prevention and Humanitarian Affairs visited Tigray and Amhara last week and saw firsthand the UN's efforts to respond to this emergency. The removal of key UN personnel will have a direct impact on the ability of the international community to deliver vital humanitarian assistance. Unfortunately, Mr. President, this is not the only obstacle to delivering aid in northern Ethiopia. I want to reiterate our urgent call for the TPLF to cease their military campaign and act in the best interests of ordinary people in Tigray. And likewise, I reiterate our call on the federal government to work with the UN and other international partners to eliminate all barriers to humanitarian access. As we've heard before, That needs to include urgent action to restore telecommunications and banking services in Tigray, enable deliveries of food and fuel, and expedite issuing visas for humanitarian response staff. Time is of the essence. Thousands of truckloads of food and medicine and millions of litres of fuel need to move into Tigray in order to avert deaths on a catastrophic scale before the end of this year. Finally, Mr. President, we know there will be no military solution to this conflict. It is past time to stop fighting and, as the Secretary-General urged, to start talking. We welcomed the African Union's decision to appoint His Excellency, former President Obasanjo, as an envoy in August. I reiterate our full support for him, the African Union, and the United Nations as they work to end this tragic conflict and help those in need. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement.
Amma kan kallattiidhaan sagalee Ameerikaa irraa isinii darbaa jiru manni maree mootummoota gamtoomanii dhimma Itoophiyaa irratti marii inni taasisaa jirudha. Mariin kun itti fufaa jira.
First and foremost, I want to offer solidarity and support to the United Nations during this trying time as they work to save lives. The United States we called for this urgent meeting today given the events that have transpired over the last week. The Ethiopian government's reckless expulsion of 7 key UN officials, including the head of UNICEF, the head of UN OCHA, and a senior official from the Office of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, are an affront to this Council, to the United Nations, and to all member states, and our shared humanitarian principles. There's no justification for the government of Ethiopia's action, none at all. Nor did the government of Ethiopia follow the proper process for calling attention to its concerns, as we've heard from the Secretary General today. What could be the justification for expelling the UN focal point responsible for ensuring food and humanitarian assistance reach those who need it? What could be the justification for expelling the UN focal point for the well-being of children in Ethiopia? There's none. And as the Secretary General made clear, U.S. personnel cannot be declared persona non grata. The UN is impartial. The UN is neutral. And in Ethiopia, it is delivering life-saving aid, including food, medicine, water, sanitation supplies, to all people in desperate need. And it is conducting important human rights investigations in conjunction with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. U.S. personnel barred from Ethiopia must be allowed to return immediately. Their work is urgent, and some of these dedicated public servants are trying to stop a famine before it's too late. The unprecedented expulsion of these UN officials follows a pattern of escalating obstruction. In July, an emergency directors group from headquarters was detained while trying to conduct an assessment mission in Tigray. 3 NGOs were suspended shortly thereafter. These actions are calculated to intimidate and silence, but they do not accomplish that goal. Instead, they push starving people to the brink. Conditions in Ethiopia today rival Somalia in 2011 during the onset of the famine. We remember that famine with horror. Over 250,000 people died despite warnings, and it didn't have to happen. Starvation should never happen, and the famine does not have to happen. The government of Ethiopia can choose to reverse course on the expulsion of UN personnel, and all parties to the conflict can immediately facilitate the full and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid. And if these calls for humanitarian access continue to go unheard, then the Security Council must act. We can ensure the UN is allowed to deliver impartial aid. We should immediately consider all tools at our disposal to facilitate this, including a Security Council resolution to save lives and promote international peace and security. Our concerns about the situation in Ethiopia go beyond this immediate humanitarian crisis. Colleagues, 3 years ago, we were talking about Ethiopia as one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, full of promise and on the cusp of a major economic and political transformation. Less than 1 year ago, this current situation was going to be a 2-week law enforcement action. Now we're hearing countless horrific accounts of rape being used as a weapon of war, of violence against civilians, of hunger being used as a tool of war, of famine looming, of UN staff being expelled, Ethiopians killing Ethiopians, thousands by the day. And the conflict is spilling over into the Amhara and Afar regions, creating even more instability and humanitarian need. As the Secretary General said in his letter to us this week, this conflict is spiraling out of control. This is a path Ethiopia's leaders are choosing: to join the club of the most isolated countries in the international community, to let down their own people. The United States has repeatedly called for the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, as well as associated regional militias, to end the fighting now, allow humanitarian access, and move toward a negotiated ceasefire immediately and without preconditions. The Council should fully support these efforts too. There is still hope. It is not too late to stop this descent. The United States believes there must be a political solution to this conflict. We're investing heavily in diplomatic efforts in partnership with the African Union and the region to address this crisis and to end the carnage. We also believe there will be no lasting peace in Ethiopia, and the country's broader project of democratic and economic renewal will not be realized until there is a wider dialogue, one that includes all Ethiopians on the future of their state. So today's meeting represents an important step toward addressing the immediate and wider crisis in Ethiopia, but it cannot be the last. Make no mistake, the Security Council's credibility is at stake today here. We must take on appropriate actions. We must take all appropriate actions to keep civilians safe, to promote accountability for human rights violations and abuses, and deliver humanitarian relief to Ethiopians in dire need. We must all call on the government of Ethiopia to reverse the expulsion immediately. Time is of the essence. Lives are on the line. If ever there was a moment to step up and do our duty, it is now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the A3+1, namely Kenya, Niger, Tunisia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines on this important crisis in Africa. I thank the Secretary General for his presentation and welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Ethiopia. Mr. President, we meet today regarding the decision by the federal government of Ethiopia to declare 7 UN officials working in Ethiopia as persona non grata, in light of the previous concerns we have expressed in calling for maximum access to enable humanitarian aid to reach Ethiopians in need. We noted the persona non grata notice with concern. We say this in the full understanding of the duties and obligations that all humanitarian actors must respect in the conduct of their work. Nevertheless, the risks of a large-scale famine which to a large extent, is being prevented by the aid delivered by the organizations to which the expelled individuals belong, raises serious concerns. Even within their sovereign rights, governments should observe their domestic and international humanitarian law obligations. The rights of the Ethiopian people to receive aid in this dire emergency are of the highest moral and legal character. We strongly urge the government and the United Nations to undertake every effort to resolve any differences and get back to ensuring aid is delivered to Ethiopians in desperate need. Concerns regarding the expelled individuals should be thoroughly considered on the basis of substantiated evidence and within a frank and genuine dialogue between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations. Discussing these issues publicly may not be constructive in the current circumstances, nor will it alleviate the suffering of the populations affected by the conflict in northern Ethiopia. The efforts of quiet diplomacy undertaken through constructive dialogue between the United Nations and Ethiopia are our best option to address this issue. In the meantime, we believe that priority must be given to the continuity of unfettered humanitarian assistance to needy people in northern Ethiopia. We welcome the renewed commitments of both sides in this regard. Mr. President, with the newly established government in Ethiopia, we reiterate that peaceful dialogue and democracy are the best mechanisms for the resolution of serious political differences. Today, we cannot help but return to this position, noticing with pain as fellow Africans the suffering of our Ethiopian brothers and sisters in Tigray and elsewhere in the country. The highest priority then at this stage is to declare an immediate ceasefire to allow for an unrestricted humanitarian access to the affected population, as well as for the re-establishment of public services in all the conflict areas. We recognize and welcome the government's extensive efforts deployed since the beginning of the conflict to deliver humanitarian aid and to enhance humanitarian access. We emphasize on the need to continue efforts towards the unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance and strongly encourage the Ethiopian authorities to fulfill all their commitments in ensuring humanitarian outreach to the people in need. The A3+1 recognizes the important role of UN humanitarian agencies and all humanitarian actors which should be supported. In this context, we call on all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. They should also ensure the respect and the protection of all humanitarian personnel and United Nations and associated personnel, as reiterated in Security Council Resolutions 1502 and 2175. At the same time, we underline the obligation of all humanitarian personnel and United Nations and its associated personnel to observe and respect the laws of the country in which they are operating in accordance with international law, including the principle of non-interference. Further, we stress the importance for humanitarian organizations to uphold the core principles of neutrality, impartiality, and humanity in their humanitarian activities, in full respect of the sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, and national unity of the host state, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia is part of a much bigger and complex crisis which is unfolding with a potential regional spillover effect that may threaten peace and security in Ethiopia and beyond. With the hostilities expanding to Amhara and Afar regions, it is clear that there could be no military solution to this crisis, and that taking up guns will only protract the conflict. The A3+1 therefore calls on all Ethiopian parties to cease hostilities and to engage in discussion with a view to conclude a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire which would pave the way for an inclusive Ethiopian-led dialogue and to national reconciliation. We also strongly call for the withdrawal of all non-Ethiopian forces from Tigray and the standing down of all militias from neighboring federal states. The African Union has a major role to play to help Ethiopians in their reconciliation efforts so that they can protect their unity and territorial integrity and recover Ethiopia's status as an anchor of regional peace and stability. In this regard, we support the active engagement of His Excellency President Obasanjo, High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of Africa, to promote, through political dialogue, peace and security in the region, particularly in Ethiopia. We call on all stakeholders and international partners to extend every possible support to the High Representative and to allow the continent the necessary space to resolve its challenges with the support of the international community. In conclusion, Mr. President, we, the A3+1, reaffirm our respect for and commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We stand in solidarity with our sister nation and in this trying moment in their pursuit for peace and stability. We hope that the new government effectively lays the foundation of a new beginning, especially by carrying the robust national dialogue on peace, cohesion, development, and unity in diversity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement.
የተከበራችሁ አድማጮች ከተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት እየተላለፈ ያለውን ስርጭት ነው የምትከታተሉት። የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ላይ እየተነጋገረ ነው። አሁን ወደዚያው እንመለስ።
Secretary General Mr. Guterres for his briefing. I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador S.K. Selassie at today's meeting. At present, the humanitarian needs in the Tigray region continue to grow. Food insecurity and displacement remain acute problems. UN humanitarian workers have overcome various challenges and delivered much-needed humanitarian supplies to many Ethiopians. China appreciates these efforts. The United Nations and other international humanitarian agencies should follow the humanitarian principles, help Ethiopia increase its humanitarian response capabilities, expand the scale of relief efforts, and prevent the deterioration of the situation. We call on the international community to provide sustained resources to the Ethiopian government in order to fill the humanitarian gap as soon as possible and ensure that aid reaches all people in need. The armed conflict poses enormous challenges to humanitarian operations. We have noticed that the Ethiopian government earnestly assumes the primary responsibility for humanitarian assistance and has proactively launched its own relief operations. At the same time, the government is also actively responding to the concerns of international humanitarian agencies. Tremendous efforts have been made in this regard. At the request of humanitarian agencies, the Ethiopian government has simplified administrative procedures on multiple occasions, reduced the number of checkpoints, scaled up land and air transportation, and allowed humanitarian agencies to bring communication equipment into conflict areas. These measures have contributed to expanding humanitarian access and ensuring the delivery of relief supplies, and therefore should be positively acknowledged. Mr. President, China regrets the disagreements surrounding the 7 UN humanitarian personnel and noted the positions and concerns expressed by the Ethiopian government and the UN respectively. We believe that a solution can only be found through dialogue and consultation. In order to prevent a deadlock. We encourage both sides to maintain contact, fully exchange information, work together to seek a solution, and avoid undermining existing trust and cooperation between the two sides. The international community should create a favorable atmosphere for a settlement through dialogue. Mr. President, a new government has just been inaugurated in Ethiopia. China expresses its welcome. China supports the Ethiopian government in making continued efforts to achieve unity among all Ethiopians, promote political dialogue, and work collectively to safeguard national unity and build a brighter future for the country. The international community should continue to provide assistance to Ethiopia while respecting the country's sovereignty and ownership. China supports African solutions to African problems and welcomes the good offices of former President Obasanjo in his capacity as the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa. The United Nations and the African Union should strengthen collaboration and jointly play a constructive role in promoting peace and reconciliation across the entire Ethiopia. I also wish to point out that the unilateral sanctions imposed on Ethiopia and Eritrea by certain countries are in breach of international law and the basic norms governing international relations and will serve only to disrupt political settlement. Such sanctions should therefore be lifted as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his briefing and for sharing his assessment on the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia. I also welcome the permanent representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador Taye Selassie, in today's briefing. The humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia has been adversely impacted due to the continuing conflict which began in November 2020. Despite the unilateral ceasefire declared by the Ethiopian government to facilitate humanitarian aid to the affected population, during the recent months, the fighting has continued and expanded to the neighboring regions of Tigray. The Ethiopian population, particularly women, children, and the elderly, continue to suffer from the ongoing conflict. In this difficult situation, the efforts of humanitarian agencies led by the UN has provided relief to the population. The northern part of Ethiopia will continue to need steady supplies of humanitarian relief in the coming months. In this regard, we note with appreciation the work of humanitarian workers and agencies. However, the unfortunate expulsion of senior UN officials coordinating the humanitarian assistance has the possibility to adversely impact the humanitarian situation. It is therefore important to de-escalate the situation through engagement and dialogue. While we are not aware of the circumstances which led to the recent developments, we are of the view that the founding principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, should always guide any humanitarian action. Humanitarian assistance and humanitarian workers should also be sensitive to the situation on the ground and adhere to these principles, especially when the host state is facing a complex politico-military situation internally. We have noted the reports of diversion of humanitarian assistance by armed groups and others. Such incidents need to be investigated and corrective measures need to be taken. It is imperative that the United Nations and its agencies continue to work closely with the government of Ethiopia to ensure that aid reaches the needy in a timely and satisfactory manner. They cannot work at cross purposes. We hope that both the UN and the Ethiopian government will make purposeful efforts to resolve expeditiously all issues in the interest of the affected population. Eschew politicization of the matter. India has consistently underscored the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation to address all issues relating to the ongoing conflict in northern Ethiopia. In this context, we welcome the formation of a new government in Ethiopia led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on 4th October and his announcement of an inclusive national dialogue. We urge all sides to exercise restraint and support the call by the Ethiopian government for opening channels of communication to build trust among themselves. We also welcome the voice of support to the Ethiopian government by the African leaders who attended the swearing-in ceremony of President Abiy Ahmed on 4th October. The work must begin on the restoration of normalcy in the lives of the people in the affected regions. To this end, we reiterate our call to find an amicable political solution in a manner that serves the interests of all its people in line with the provisions of the Constitution of Ethiopia. In conclusion, Mr. President, the political and economic stability of Ethiopia is paramount, not just to the Horn of Africa, but the entire African continent. The international community and the African Union need to support all efforts that are directed towards humanitarian assistance and an early resolution of the conflict. India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Kan dhaggeeffachaa jirtanu mana maree mootummoota gamtoomaniirraa kallattiidhaan kan darbaa jirudha. Kun raadiyoo sagalee Ameerikaatti dhaggeeffattoota keenya.
Welcome the permanent representative of Ethiopia to our meeting today. Mr. President, we all concerned about the deteriorated humanitarian situation in Tigray, especially its consequences and adverse impacts on the daily lives of millions of people. As responding to this humanitarian need in Ethiopia is the most urgent task that requires the international community support, we emphasize the critical role of the UN agency, including UNICEF, OCHA, and other international partners in this regard. Therefore, we regret the recent decision undertaken by the government of Ethiopia to declare persona non grata to 7 UN officials. We are afraid that the decision will affect humanitarian operation in the country. In this context, we call for dialogue, trust building, and cooperation between the government of Ethiopia, the United Nations, and other parties to overcome these differences so as to achieve humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, we welcome some progresses of the practical activity carried out by the United Nations, including humanitarian organizations and international and regional partners for 10,000 of Ethiopians over the past few months, including people in Tigray. Recently, the first round of food distribution to people in Afar and Amhara region have been completed by the World Food Programs. However, we understand that the access to and distribution of humanitarian assistance still remain far from satisfying the need of urgent assistance in many parts of Tigray. The conflict has resulted in other systemic issues that may lead to further deteriorations. ADSG Martin Griffith said, 5.2 million people are in need of food aid, including 400,000 people living in famine-like conditions. In the face of such danger, we call on all parties to fulfill their obligation under humanitarian law to prevent a famine from occurring. It is crucial to ensure safe, effective, and efficient delivery of and access to humanitarian assistance to the Tigray region and bordering area. Mr. President, we also share concern of the international community, including those expressed by the Secretary General, about the alarming levels of violence and killing against civilians, including women, children, and humanitarian workers, as well as the destruction of infrastructures indispensable to the civilian population in Tigray. The acts of violence are unacceptable and run counter to the international humanitarian law. We call for an immediate cessation of hostility, upholding responsibility under international humanitarian law, and ensuring the protection of civilians, especially women and children. Mr. President, the crisis in Tigray stems from complicated political, historical, and ethnic reasons. The background requires relevant parties to engage in dialogue and reconciliation rather than further hatred, thereby creating favorable conditions for starting an Ethiopia-led political dialogue. It is high time for a compromise to be made toward a comprehensive solution for sustained stability and development in Ethiopia on the basic principles of the international law and the UN Charter. We call on Ethiopian authority and all other concerned parties to give the highest priority to the interests of its people. In this process, the international community, including the Security Council, should support all efforts toward this end in full respect of independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the conflict and situation in Tigray have had certain impacts on the region that require relevant parties to exercise self-restraint. In this connection, we support the constructive engagement of neighboring countries and regional organizations for peace, security, national reconciliation, national unity, and development in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, mi delegación agradece al secretario general por su informe. Damos también la bienvenida al representante permanente de Etiopía entre nosotros. Tomamos nota con preocupación de las aseveraciones del gobierno etíope que llevaron a la expulsión de los funcionarios de las Naciones Unidas. Hemos escuchado igualmente la muy clara y completa posición del secretario general. Antes de hacer consideraciones en torno a los argumentos presentados por las dos partes, lo primero que debemos señalar es que la decisión del gobierno de Etiopía tiene un impacto directo en las labores humanitarias que se realizan en el terreno. Estamos a un mes de cumplir un año del inicio de un conflicto.
የተከበራችሁ አድማጮች ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ ራዲዮ ጣቢያ በቴሌቪዥንና በራዲዮ መስመሮቻችን በቀጥታ የሚተላለፍላችሁን ስርጭት ነው እየተከታተላችሁ ያላችሁት። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት በሰሞኑን የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት 7 የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ባለስልጣናትን ማስወጣቱን ተከትሎና በሰሜን የሀገሪቱ ክፍል ያለውን ሁኔታ በሚመለከት በመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት እየተካሄደ ያለውን ውይይት ነው አሁን በቀጥታ እየተከታተላችሁ ያላችሁት። በነገራችን ላይ በሁለት ወር ባልሞላ ጊዜ ውስጥ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ላይ ሲመካከር የዛሬ ለሶስተኛ ጊዜ መሆኑ ነው። ከዚህ በቀደም ባሉ ቀናትም እንደዚህ በግልጽ አይተላለፍ እንጂ ዝግ የሆነ ስብሰባ ተቀምጦ ነበረ። አራተኛው ማለት ነው እሱን ከቆጠርን። በራዲዮ በ9310 በ11720 በ15660 ኪሎ ሄርትዝ ላይ ያለን በኢትዮሳት በመደበኛው መስመር ቪኦኤ ኢትዮጵያ ቻናል ላይ እንገኛለን። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ ናቸው ይህንን የዛሬውን ውይይት በንግግር የከፈቱት። እየተስፋፋ የመጣውን የሰብአዊ ጉዳዮች ችግር ካለፈው ነሐሴ አንስቶ ሲያሳስቡ መቆየታቸውና ችግሩ እየተበላሸ መምጣቱን ተናግረዋል። አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ 7 ሚሊዮን ሰው ትግራይ፣ አማራ፣ አፋር ውስጥ የምግብና የተለያዩ አጣዳፊ ድጋፎችን እንደሚፈልግ ተናግረዋል። 400,000 ሰው ቸነፈር በሚመስል ሁኔታ ላይ እንደሚገኝም ተናግረዋል። በቅርቡ መፍትሄ ካልተፈለገ ሁኔታው ሶማሊያ የዛሬ 10 ዓመት ገጥሟት የነበረውን አይነት 200,000 ሰው ያለቀበትን የቸነፈር ሁኔታ ወደሚመስል አደጋ ሊለወጥ እንደሚችል በብርቱ አሳስበዋል። የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ተፈላጊነት የሌላቸው ወይም ፐርሶና ኖን ግራታ ሲል የወሰነባቸው 7 አባላቱ በአፋጣኝ ወደ ስራቸው እንዲመለሱ እንዲደረግም አሳስበዋል። እንደዚሁም አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ በርከት ያሉ ሌሎችም ችግሮችን አንስተው ወገኖቹ ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያሉት ወገኖች በአፋጣኝ ለሰላምና ለድርድር እንዲቀመጡ ጥሪ አስተላልፈዋል። የጸብ ሁኔታ እንዲቆም ጠይቀዋል። ንግግር የሰላም መሰረት ነው ብለዋል አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ። ሰላም ደግሞ የብልጽግናና የመረጋጋት መሰረት ነው ብለዋል። ለሁሉም ኢትዮጵያውያንና ለአካባቢው ህዝብም ጠንክረን እንስራ ሲሉ አሳስበዋል። ዝግጅታችን እስከ ስብሰባው መጨረሻ ይቀጥላል። በየአጋጣሚው ጊዜ እንዳገኘን እንዲሁ ጠቅለል እያደረግን የተናጋሪዎቹን ሐሳቦች እናቀርብላችኋለን። በመጨረሻም ማጠቃለያ እናቀርብላችኋለን። ስቱዲዮ ውስጥ አብረውኝ ከትግርኛ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን አብርሃም ዘሬ እንዲሁም ከአፋን ኦሮሞ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን ደግሞ በፍቃዱ ሞረዳ አብረን እንገኛለን። አሁን ወደ አብርሃም ላሸጋግራችሁ ለትግርኛው።
ክቡራት ተኻልትና ትሰምዑ ዘለኹም ባይቶ ፀጥታ ውድብ ሕብራት ሃገራት ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ምልክቱ ዝገብሮ ዘሎ ዘተ እዩ እዚ ዘተ ኣብ ሕብራት ኣብ ኒውዮርክ ከተማ ኒውዮርክ ዝካየድ ዘሎ ኮይኑ ብዋና ጸሓፊ ሕብራት ሃገራት አንቶኒዮ ጉተሬስ ዝተኸፍተ እዩ ቀፂለን ሃገራት ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ምልክትን መቕረብ መብሪ ዛባ ሃገራት ኣየርላንድ ዓዲ እንግሊዝ ሜክሲኮ ሸውዓተ ሃገራት ሰለስተ ሃገራት አፍሪቃ ካልኦት ይርከቡን ኣብ ቀጻሊ መደብና ተኸታተልና ክንቐርበልኩም ኢና ምሳና ጽንዑ
Hordoftoota keenya kun sagaleen kun kan isinii darbaa jiru sagalee Ameerikaa irraati. Kallattiidhaan kan isinii darbaa jirudha. Sagantaan kun kan isinii dabarsaa jiru dhaabbata mootummoota gamtoomaniitti manni maree nageenyaa keessumaa immoo namootaan 7 warra gargaarsa irratti hojjetanu mootummaan Itoophiyaa akka biyyaa ba'an gochuu isaatiif dura yookaan barreessaan mana mootummoota gamtoomanii Antooniyoo Guterres gaaffii gaafataniidhaan walga'iin kun kan godhamaa jiru. Dhimma kana irratti Guterres haasaa godhaniiru. Isaanitti aanee immoo namoonni biyyoota adda addaa bakka bu'een biyyoota adda addaa yaada isaanii dhiyeessaa jiru. Guterres akka jedhanitti akkuma sila dubbatamee jedhee yeroo ammaa Itoophiyaa keessatti Affaarii fi Amaaraan Tigraayin dabalatee namoonni miiliyoonii 7 rakkina keessa akka jiran kana keessaa miiliyoonii 5 immoo Tigraay keessa akka jiran namoonni 700 ol ta'an immoo ammas rakkina beela fakkaatu keessa yookaan beelatti deemaa jiru jedhaniitu yaadaa jiru. Wanti kun yoo guddachaa deeme gara isa Soomaaliyaan bara 2011tti beela seen keessa galte nu galchaa jira. Kanaaf iyyuu falli barbaadamuu qaba. Falli immoo nageenya jedhaniiru. Haasaan kun itti fufeera biyyoonni adda addaa yaada isaanii kennaa jiru. Kanumaan isinii daddabarsa wajjiniin turraa jechuudha.
President. We are grateful to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for the information he has provided on developments in Ethiopia. We also welcome the participation in today's meeting of the Permanent Representative of Ethiopia to the United Nations, Taye Selassie. First and foremost, we'd like to congratulate all Ethiopians on the forming of the new government on the 4th of October. The conclusion of the electoral process is confirmation that the Ethiopian political forces are ready for dialogue in order to find solutions to problems that the whole population of the country is facing in order to develop the state, to promote peace and well-being.
Российская Федерация продолжит поддерживать территориальную целостность, суверенитет и независимость дружественной нам Эфиопии. Мы продолжаем внимательно следить за развитием военно-политической ситуации на севере страны. По-прежнему считаем тиграйское досье внутренним делом Эфиопии, а национальный потенциал примирения неисчерпанным. Исходим из того, что Аддис-Абебе под силу самостоятельно решать свои проблемы при поддержке международного сообщества, прежде всего представителей региона. В этой связи поддерживаем усилия по поиску развязок, предпринимаемые недавно назначенным высоким представителем Африканского союза по Африканскому рогу Олусегуном Обасанджо. Знаем, что он уже активно приступил к своим обязанностям и провел первые контакты в эфиопской столице. Ожидаем конкретных результатов этой работы. При этом полагаем, что преднамеренное повышение градуса международной риторики в отношении ситуации на севере страны и зашкаливающая политизация гуманитарного досье только мешает панафриканской организации наладить посреднические усилия. Учитывая всю глубину противоречий и сложный исторический контекст, процесс этот не будет быстрым. Поэтому лишь синхронизация усилий и кропотливая дипломатическая работа, в том числе по двусторонним каналам, может дать результат. Уверены в том, что давление с задействованием Совета Безопасности ООН, угрозы принятием резолюций, применение незаконных односторонних санкций и создание токсичной атмосферы в средствах массовой информации контрпродуктивны. Господин председатель, что касается гуманитарной обстановки на севере Эфиопии, то мы полностью разделяем озабоченности по поводу растущих там гуманитарных потребностей. Регион, который и до кризиса был нестабильным с точки зрения продовольственной безопасности, находится в очень тяжелом положении. Продолжение насилия в Тиграе и соседних регионах Амхара и Афар серьезно обостряет общую ситуацию, провоцирует новые потоки внутренне перемещенных лиц и беженцев. Есть и конкретные проблемы, которые требуют срочного реагирования, и которые, как мы считаем, можно и нужно срочно решать. В первую очередь имеем в виду ситуацию с застрявшими в Тиграе грузовиками Всемирной продовольственной программы ООН. Считаем недопустимым блокировать транспорт гуманитарных организаций ООН, а тем более использовать их в иных целях. Мы уже неоднократно говорили в Совете Безопасности и на других площадках, что медийный фокус исключительно на гуманитарной ситуации в Тиграе ведет к политизации этого вопроса и создает дополнительные разделительные линии в эфиопском обществе. Нельзя преуменьшать беды ничуть не менее страдающего от конфликта населения в регионах Афар и Амхара, а также проблемы в других районах страны. Господин председатель, Россия неизменно поддерживает гуманитарные усилия ООН, выражает признательность гуманитарным и медицинским работникам, которые в непростых и зачастую опасных условиях оказывают срочную гуманитарную помощь всем нуждающимся в самых удаленных уголках планеты, в том числе и в Эфиопии. Ежегодно вносим свой финансовый вклад в работу ряда программ и фондов. Намерены и далее продолжать это содействие, доверяя опыту и экспертизе гуманитарного крыла ООН. Сожалеем по поводу принятого на прошлой неделе решения Аддис-Абебы выдворить из страны сотрудников ООН. Это, безусловно, не будет способствовать разрешению острейшего гуманитарного кризиса в стране. Вместе с тем призываем не драматизировать произошедшее. Считаем, что через взаимоуважительный диалог Аддис-Абеба и секретариат смогут восстановить доверие и полюбовно разрешить возникшие противоречия в интересах нуждающегося в помощи населения. К этому делу остается много вопросов, особенно в отношении шагов, которые были или не были предприняты для того, чтобы предотвратить негативное развитие событий. В этой связи особенно важно тщательно разобраться и сделать выводы на будущее, с тем, чтобы такие инциденты более не повторялись. Как и применительно к другим ситуациям в мире, твердо стоим на том, что гуманитарная помощь должна оказываться в полном соответствии с резолюцией Генассамблеи 46-182 и базовыми руководящими принципами ООН, международным правом и национальным законодательством. Вынуждены еще раз констатировать императивность налаживания доверительного и конструктивного диалога, а также тесного сотрудничества с суверенными эфиопскими властями, продолжающими покрывать львиную долю всех гумпотребностей Тиграя и соседних регионов. В заключение хотели бы подтвердить готовность Российской Федерации продолжать способствовать нормализации ситуации в Эфиопии и на Африканском роге в целом. Я благодарю за внимание.
ከተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት እየተላለፈ ያለውን ቀጥታ ስርጭት ነው የምትከታተሉት። የተከበራችሁ አድማጮች፣ የአሜሪካ ድምፅ ራዲዮ ጣቢያ ነው። የኢትዮጵያ ልዑክ አሁን ይናገራሉ።
Thank you, Mr. President. Congratulations on assuming your presidency for the month of October. I would like to convey Ethiopia's best wishes in the discharge of your responsibilities. I also thank our Secretary General. Mr. President, to hide my surprise in the convening of this meeting of the Security Council, we find it incomprehensible for this august body to discuss the decision of a sovereign state exercised within the domain of international law and sovereign prerogative. There have been several instances where governments had expelled UN staff and other diplomatic envoys for so many disclosed and undisclosed reasons. Did the Council ever meet to vindicate such a decision? Not to the best of our recollection. Mr. President, we truly hoped Council members would have the insight to leave this matter to the government of Ethiopia and the United Nations. At the outset, I would like to register our position that the government of Ethiopia is not under any legal obligation to provide justifications or explanation for its decisions. Excellencies, we are obliged to make reference to the basic norms of the United Nations and its humanitarian operations. The General Assembly resolution on guiding principles for humanitarian assistance, 46/182, provides the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity of states must be fully respected in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. The most fundamental element of the sovereignty of the state has to do with their prerogative to determine who enters, remains in, exists in their territory. When we appeal for support and work with the UN or other humanitarian operators, we have not forgone this fundamental right. Therefore, the government will continue exercising its due right and responsibility on monitoring and screening all humanitarian operators in Ethiopia. Any suggestion to the contrary is unacceptable. As to the legality of the decision, leaving the details aside, the UN itself can be quoted for arguing decisions of persona non grata apply to the UN as well. Mr. President, when it comes to the obligation of UN staff, the rules are unequivocal. Article 101, paragraph 3 of the UN Charter provides all staff members employed by the United Nations must have the highest standards of efficiency, competence, and integrity. In the context of humanitarian operations, integrity entails adhering to principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. It also requires respect for the laws and police power of the host state. Furthermore, they must respect the Code of Conduct of UN, which, among others, provides the following. First, UN staff shall neither seek nor accept instruction from any government or from any other source external to the organization. Second, staff members shall not use their office or knowledge gained from their official functions for private gain, financial or otherwise, or for the private gain of any third party, including family, friends, and those they favor. Third, staff members shall not communicate to any government, entity, person, or any other sources any information known to them by reason of their official position. These cardinal principles, for the safeguard of which UN staff enter a solemn oath and swear on their conscience, mean that in the presence of contradicting views, competing interests, political pressures, and all forms of temptation, the UN staff will remain neutral. In the presence of deceit, coercion, and vested interest, they will preserve their independence. And in the existence of consideration that may appear to be reasonable basis for decision, UN staff will be guided by humanity only. The UN staff, Ethiopia expelled, sidelined their oaths, the rules of professional conduct, and the principles of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, let me cite few examples among the multitude of transgressions that we selected with great care and caution. Needless to say, the misconduct of few individuals doesn't speak to the professional and able team of the UN in Ethiopia or anywhere else. Rather, it speaks of the serious ethical dilemma that existed in the humanitarian operation in Ethiopia for the past 11 months. These individuals executed the conspiracy created by TPLF and its member to generate an image of extreme casualty that warrants quote-unquote humanitarian intervention and rescues the criminal group. To use their own words, they were looking to create a Darfur-like situation. They suddenly and overnight created 1 million victims of health disaster, while OCHA country office reports 2.8 million people that need emergency health assistance. The main OCHA office was made to report 3.8 million, only because that level of inflation of misery was needed to elevate the crisis to level 3. They categorized the situation in Tigray under IPC 5, based on data collected from a region of 6 million population by a single FAO staff and interpreted by 2 UN staff that are Ethiopian and open TPLF supporters based in Rome. They assisted in fabrication of false allegations submitted to the UN Security Council as a white paper. The white paper contained unfounded allegations, including the use of hunger as a weapon, and proffered the need to apply Resolution 2417/18. The former head of OCHA was made to report to this council 152 Ethiopians died due to food shortage, while such incident had never occurred. They made up the data and went to the extent of disinforming this global security body. About 2 weeks ago, they reported 12 individuals died of hunger in an IDP camp, while the organization running the IDP camp, an internal organization itself, came out and stated the allegations are simply false. They implored UN agencies to conduct investigations outside of their mandate to meet the instruction of TPLF to generate exhibits matching the false allegation released on medias and to supposedly substantiate a case before the ICC. They didn't even show mercy to victims of gender-based violence. First, in violation of the protection of protocols of safe houses for victims of gender-based violence, they invited TPLF armed men and militia to the safe houses. In addition, they exposed the safe house before an international media and invited interviewers and interrogators to safe houses to intimidate victims and elicit testimonies. This, Mr. President, is happening in a city where close to 13,000 detainees and prisoners were released with absolute impunity, and thousands of armed youths are roaming in the streets, already creating terror on residents. These individuals recorded a UN staff meeting and gave a copy to TPLF for the sake of providing it with material it could use to back its false allegations. These individuals openly celebrated and make other UN staff cheer the so-called victory of TPLF and the withdrawal of the National Defense Forces from Tigray. They openly conducted activism in support of TPLF, a group proscribed as terrorists, and make political statements that instigate violence and inflame the conscience of the Ethiopian public. They assisted siphoning food, medicine, communication equipment, all other essential supplies and equipment and transfer to TPLF. Right before their expulsion, they were facilitating the deportation of ethnically segregated group of Ethiopian migrants from Saudi Arabia and their resettlement in third country in Africa for training and preparation before they join combat with TPLF. In effect, a parallel UN operation that completely sidelined the UN country office was created. Apart from the selfish interest of individuals, we have evidences that the entire endeavor is created by a higher and more sophisticated motivation that seeks to undermine the Ethiopian state and rescue the TPLF. Ethiopia deeply resents this experience. Mr. President, expulsion was not our primary course of action. In multiple occasions, we explained our concern to UN officials. On July 8, 2021, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Ethiopia wrote a letter to the UN Secretariat explaining in great details the misconducts of the UN staff that require corrective measures. We also summoned some individuals and warned them to halt their misconduct. Nevertheless, the transgression continued unabated. Mr. President, we believe the UN agencies and their honorable role are undermined by these few individuals. Our request from the United Nations is, first, to deploy new staff that are aware of and will adhere to their professional code of conduct. Overwhelming majority of UN staff fulfill this requirement and would distance themselves from political mercenarism. The government of Ethiopia stands ready to assist expeditious deployment of the replacement. More importantly, we request the UN to review all the reports, statements, and assessments that were produced on the situation in Ethiopia in the past year. These reports and data and information they contain must be verified. This audit is necessary for us to build and sustain trust and advance the exemplary cooperation between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations. Mr. President, the United Nations is an invaluable development and humanitarian partner for Ethiopia for many years. I want to underscore the great values we attach to the support of our organization during this difficult time. We also believe majority of the UN staff we have the privilege of working with have the requisite integrity and decency. Mr. President, I would like to reassure this Council the new Ethiopian government established with the popular will and mandate of the Ethiopian people to herald peace and prosperity stands ready to work with the international community to address long-standing and current challenges. We welcome and value initiative by leaders of our region, the African Union, and the support of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres toward sustaining peace and stability in Ethiopia. We assure you that we will facilitate the visa requests. No one should doubt the Ethiopian tradition of hospitality. What we ask is respect, dignity, and honesty, open and candid discussion. We will, as we did in the past, we will always stretch our hands to all those who treat us with dignity and equality. That is indeed the story of an Ethiopian life since the time of the League of Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement and invite the Secretary General of the United Nations.
የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ጠቅላላ የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ውይይት ወደ መጠናቀቁ ነው። ዋና ጸሐፊው የመዝጊያ ንግግር ያደርጋሉ።
Anything I have cherished during all this period is to maintain a very effective and operational relationship with the government of Ethiopia and with its Prime Minister. To the effect that I had many criticism in the global media about that, accusing me of being biased in favor of the Ethiopian government. So it is with total, I would say, in a spirit of complete easiness, that I would like to ask you one thing, Mr. Ambassador. If there is any written document provided by the Ethiopian government to any UN institution about any of the 8 members of the UN that were expelled, I would like to receive a copy of that document because I have not had any knowledge of any of them, and it would be very useful for me to detect if documents are given to the UN and not given to my knowledge. Then I have to investigate what has happened in my organization. So I ask you please, Mr. Ambassador, to provide me as a copy of any of the written documents written by the government of Ethiopia about any of the 8 that were expelled by Ethiopia in this regard. And I would recall that twice I told the Prime Minister that if there were concerns about lack of, I'd say, lack of impartiality of the UN staff, that I asked him, please send me those situations for me to be able to investigate. Twice I asked it to the Prime Minister. Until now, I had no response to these requests. And so, for us, the question is very simple. We believe that Ethiopia has not the right to expel these 8 members of the UN. We believe Ethiopia is violating international law in doing so. And we are ready to cooperate with the government of Ethiopia in relation to any situation in which the government of Ethiopia feels that any member of the UN is not behaving in total impartiality, in total independence, as humanitarian law prescribes and humanitarian principles establish. I want to tell you, Mr. Ambassador, we want to cooperate with the government of Ethiopia because we have only one agenda in Ethiopia, and that agenda is the people of Ethiopia. Tigrayans, Amarans, Afaris, Somalis, the people of Ethiopia. The people of Ethiopia is suffering. We have no other interest but to help stop that suffering. Thank you very much.
የተከበራችሁ የአሜሪካ ድምፅ ተከታታዮች በቴሌቪዥንና በራዲዮ በቀጥታ ስናስተላልፍላችሁ የቆየ ነው። አሁንም እያስተላለፍን ያለ ነው። ወደ ኢትዮጵያ አምባሳደር እንመለሳለን። አሁን
Mr. Secretary General, I hear you loud and clear. I fully understand and realize the support you have given to our people and my government as well. We know where your heart is. You have approached our issue with candidness, with candor, and we highly respect that. As to the asks, I will definitely communicate to the appropriate authorities, and we will, of course, expeditiously, and as I have made it clear in my statement, this is an issue that has to be dealt between Ethiopia and the United Nations. Whatever document that will be available will be submitted to your office, Your Excellency. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ላይ 2 ወር ባልሞላ ጊዜ ውስጥ ለአራተኛ ጊዜ ያደረገውን ስብሰባ ነው። እስካሁን ድረስ ስትከታተሉ የቆያችሁት የተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቻችን ባለፈው ሐሙስ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ዝግ ስብሰባ አድርጎ ነበረ። የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ በጠየቁት መሰረት ይህ ግልጽ ስብሰባ እንዲደረግ ተጠይቋል። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ በዚህ ስብሰባ ላይ በመዝጊያው ላይ አጠር ያለ ንግግር አድርገዋል። ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር የተዋጣን ግንኙነት እንዲኖር ጥረት ሲያደርጉ መቆየታቸውንና እንደሚያደርጉም ተናግረዋል። አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ እንደውም ብለዋል እኔ ለኢትዮጵያ ታደላለህ ለመንግስቱ ታደላለህ በሚል ዓለም አቀፍ መገናኛ ብዙሃን ሲወቅሱኝ ቆይተዋል ብለዋል። በኢትዮጵያ መንግስት እስካሁን ድረስ ለአምባሳደር ታዬ አጽቀሥላሴ በኢትዮጵያ በተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የኢትዮጵያ ልዑክ ባቀረቡት ጥያቄ እስካሁን ድረስ ለተባበሩት መንግስታት የገባ ድርጅት ኢትዮጵያ ካባረረቻቸው ከ8ቱ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ባለስልጣናትና ሰራተኞች መካከል በአንዱም ላይ ቢሆን አንድም ደብዳቤ ካለ እባክዎ አቅርቡልኝ የማውቀው ነገር የለም ስለሚባለው ክስ ብለዋል። ለዚህ ለአንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ ጥያቄ አምባሳደር ታዬ ወዲያው ምላሽ ሰጥተዋል። ንግግሮች መደረግ ያለባቸው በኢትዮጵያና በተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት መካከል እንዲሆን ጠይቀው አፋጥነው እነዚያን ማስረጃዎች እንደሚያቀርቡ አሳስበዋል። እንዲሁም ልቦናው ከኛ ጋር መሆኑን እናደንቃለን ብለዋል አምባሳደር ታየ ለዋና ጸሐፊው መልእክት። ለማንኛውም የእነዚህን የመንግስታቱ ድርጅትን ባለስልጣናትና ሰራተኞች መባረር በተመለከተ ኢትዮጵያ የማባረር መብት የላትም ብለዋል በግልጽ ዋና ጸሐፊው። ኢትዮጵያ ዓለም አቀፍ ሕግን ጥሳለች ብለዋል እነዚህን ሰዎች በማባረር። እናም ማንኛውም የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት አባል ከስነ ምግባር ውጪ ያደረገው ምንም አድራጎት ካለ እንድናውቅ እንፈልጋለን ብለዋል። አጀንዳችን አንድ ብቻ ነው ብለዋል አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ። የኢትዮጵያ ሕዝብ መከራ እንዲያበቃ እንፈልጋለን ብለዋል። አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ በንግግሩ በዚህ ስብሰባ መጀመሪያ ላይም እንደዚሁ ንግግር አድርገዋል። ወደዚህ ከመመለሴ በፊት ስቱዲዮ ውስጥ አብረውኝ ከትግርኛ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን አብርሃም ዘሬ፣ ከአፋን ኦሮሞ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን በፍቃዱ ሞረዳነን ይሄንን ፕሮግራም እያስተናገድን ያለ ነው። ሶሎሞን አባተ ነኝ አብሬያችሁ ያለሁት ለአማርኛው ስርጭት። ወደ ሌሎች ንግግሮችና ማጠቃለያዎች ከመሸጋገሬ በፊት አጠር ላሉ የመጨረሻ ማጠቃለያዎች ወደ ባልደረቦች ልምራችሁ። በቅድሚያ አብርሃምን ጋብዛለሁ።
የመስክነካ ሰሎሞን ተካትሎ ጽናዕኩም ባይተጽታ ሕብረት ሀገራት ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ምልክቶ ገብሮ ዝጸንሕ ዘተዩ ኣብዚ ዘተ ሪተን ዘቕረባ አየርላንድ፣ ኢስቶኒያ፣ ፈረንሳይ፣ ኖርዌይ፣ ዓዲ እንግሊዝ፣ አሜሪካ፣ ቱኒዝያ፣ ቻይና፣ ህንዲ፣ ቪየትናም፣ ሜክሲኮ፣ ራሻ ክኾና ከለዋ መጀመሪያትን ኩለን መብዛሕተን ተናገራት ኢትዮጵያ ዝግበረቶ ዘሎ ናይ ዝሰጎጎቶም ናይ ሰብኣዊ መሰላት ሓገዝ ብምቋም ደጊማ ክትፅውዑን ናይ ውድብ ሕብረት ሃገራት ዘይተገደበ ሓገዝ ከተፍቅድን ክፅውዑ ከለዉ ገለ ካብተን ሃገራት ከዓ ኢትዮጵያ ኣብ ውሽጢ ጉዳያት ስለ ዝኾነ እዚ ናይ ደገ ምትእትታው ናይ ውሽጣዊ ስራሕታ ይኽብሉ ገሊፆም ኣብ መጨረሻ ርእቶ ዝሃበ ኣምባሳደር ኢትዮጵያ ኣብ ሕብረት ሃገራት እዩ። ኣምባሳደር ኢትዮጵያ ነቲ ብዝተፈላለዩ ሃገራት ክቐርብሉ ዝፀንሐ ነቐፌታዊ መልሲቡ እሱ ኣብ መግለፂኡ ኢትዮጵያ ዝወሰደቶ ስጉምቲ እቶም ኣባላት ውድብ ሕብረት ሃገራት ካብ መዝነቶም ወፂኦም ኣብ ናይ ውሽጢ ኣብ ካልእ ተግባራት ስለ ዝውዓሉ ምዃኑ ደጋጊሙ ገሊፁ ኣብ መግለፂኡ እቲ ኣምባሳደር ኢትዮጵያ እውን ቅድሚ ሕጂ ጥራዕኖም ንውድብ ሕብረት ሃገራት ከም ዝሃቡን መልሲ ከም ዘይተቐበሉን ብኡ ምክንያት ከዓ ነቲ ስጉምቲ ክወስዱ ከም ዝተደረኹ ክገልጽ ከሎ ግብረ መልሲ ዝሃበ ከዓ ዋና ጸሓፊ ሕብረት ሃገራት አንቶኒዮ ጉተረዝ ኣብ መግለፂኡ ኢትዮጵያ ንሕና ኣብ ኢትዮጵያ ዘለና ሓንቲ ዕላማ ንሱ ከዓ ንሰላማዊ ህዝቢ ሓገዝ ንምቕራብ እዩ። እንተኾነ እቲ ብኣምባሳደር ዝቐረበ ደብዳቤ ጽሒፍና ጥራዕና ጽሒፍና ደጋጊምና ዝመጽእ የለን ዝብል ግን ከም ዘይበጽሐንን ዝኾነ መዝህሉ ከዓ በጽሕፈትና ከምርምሮ ድሉ ምዃኑን ግልጽነተይ ኣብዚ ቁርብነተይ ይገልጽ ኣሎ። ምሳይ ኣብ ስቱድዮ ዘለዉ ሰሎሞን ኣባተ ካብ ቋንቋ ኣምሓርኛ በፈቃዱ ካብ ቋንቋ ኦሮሞ ናብ በፈቃዱ ከሕልፈኩም።
Egaa hordoftoota sagalee Ameerikaa akkuma irra deddeebinee sila dubbachaa turre gidduutti kan gochaa turre walga'iin mootummoota gamtoomanii kan mana maree nageenyaa dhimma Itoophiyaa irratti keessumaa immoo namootaan hojjettoota gargaarsaa Itoophiyaan biyyaa keessaa baastee ilaalchise barreessaan mootummoota gamtoomanii akka manni maree kun kan irratti dubbatu gaaffii godhaniin walga'ii godhameedha. Walga'iin kun walga'ii dhimma Itoophiyaa kana irratti gidduu kana gaggeeffamaa jiran keessaa isa tokkodha. Dhimma kana irratti biyyoottan 13 hirmaatanii yaada isaanii kennaniiru. Biyyoottan kun hundumtuu gara caalaansaa wanti jedhamaa inni akkuma waliigalaatti mootummaan Itoophiyaa namootan gargaarsaa kana biyya keessaa ari'achuu isaa biyyaa baasuu isaa sirrii miti gaarii miti hin deeggarru jedhanii warri kaan sagalee laafaadhaan warri kaan immoo sagalee cimaadhaan balaaleffatanii akka sirrii hin taane dubbataniiru. Akka waliigalaatti immoo maayinni hundumti jaraa biyyoottan dubbatan kun maal jedhanii rakkina biyya sana keessa jiru waan seenaa biyyaatiin wal qabate waan ta'e fi eenyuyyuu gareen kamiyyuu taanaan karaa qawweetiin karaa wal lolaansaatiin waan hiikuu hin dandeenyeedhaa fi walitti dhufanii araaraa fi marii geggeessanii rakkinni kun hiikamuu qabaa waan jedhu irratti akka walii galaniidha kan dubbatanii yaada jarri dubbate ala walitti qabnee ilaallu jechuudha. Achi ambaasaaddarri Itoophiyaa Taayyee Asqasillaasees yaada kana dubbataniiru. Ambaasaaddarri Taayyeen ala kaasan maal jedhanii biyyoottan adda addaa yeroo kanaan dura namootan mootummoota gamtoomaniif ta'e dippiloomaatota adda addaa biyya isaaniitti arjachaa turani. Seenaan akkanaa jira garuu manni maree mootummootaa kuni dhimma kanarratti walgahii godhee beekaa laata jedhanii gaafatanii namoonni amma argataniiru jedhan kuni balleessaa isaan godhan hundumaa gaggabaabsanii dubbatanii dhimma kanarratti immoo gaafa ji'a adoolessaatiin duratti ji'a waxabajjii keessa mootummaan Itoophiyaa xalayaa galchuusaa balleessa waan namoonni kun hojjechaa jiranu xalayaadhaan beeksisuusaa dubbatanii jiru. Achi deebi'anii booddeetti immoo fuula durattis dhaabbanni mootummoota gamtoomanii namoota gargaarsa hojjechuu danda'an kan namoota biraa yoo fidanii mootummaan Itoophiyaa akka simatee fudhatu dubbataniiru. Dhumarratti barreessaan mootummoota gamtoomanii yaada ambaasaadder Taayyeen dubbatan kanarratti haasaa godhaniin xalayaan barreeffame yoo jiraate yoo an arguu dhabaadhe natti kenna amma ammaatti homaa tokko hin argine. Eegasiyyuu muummee ministeera Itoophiyaatti allama waan yakka namoonni kun huumani waan ibsu naa kenna kanarratti qorannoo goonee tarkaanfii fudhannaa jennee gaafanne naaf hin kennine jedhanii dubbatanii sabooddee ambaasaadder Taayyeen ragaa jiru hundumayyuu walitti qabne dhiyeessinaa jedhanii kanumaan xumurameera walga'iinarraa. Yaanni walitti qabeen dubbadhu kana booda immoo yoo yeroo qabaanne namoonni biyyoonni adda addaa maal jedhan waan jedhu immoo ilaallaa kanuma.
አመሰግናለሁ አብርሃምንና በፍቃዱን ይቀጥላል። ክቡራትና ክቡራን ይህ ቀጥታ ስርጭታችን እያጠቃለልን እስከ ለተወሰኑ ደቂቃዎች ያህል አብረናችሁ እንቆያለን። በዚህ በዛሬው የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ጠቅላላ ይቅርታ የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ስብሰባ ላይ በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ በተነጋገረው ስብሰባ ላይ ንግግር ያደረጉት 14 ተወካዮችና የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊን ጨምሮ ማለት ነው በኤ3 እና 1 የሚባሉ የአፍሪካና የግሪናዳይን ተጠሪዎች በቱኒዚያ ተወክለው ንግግር አድርገዋል። ይሄ ማለት 15ቱም የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት አባላት በንግግሩ ተወክለዋል ማለት ነው። ሁሉም የተናገሩት ሁሉም የሚስማሙባቸው ደጋግሞ የሚያነሷቸው ጉዳዮች የኢትዮጵያ ሉዓላዊነት አንድነትና የግዛት ጥብቅነት የጸና እንዲሆን የሁላችንም ፍላጎት ነው። እያንዳንዱ ተናጋሪ በዚህ ላይ አጽንኦት ሳያደርግ ያለፈ የለም። እንደዚሁም በአሁኑ ጊዜ ኢትዮጵያ ላይ እየታየው ያለው ሁኔታ በሲቪሎች ላይ እየደረሰ ያለው መንገላታት፣ ሞትና ሌሎችም ጥቃቶችና በደሎች እጅግ እያሳስቧቸው እንደሆነ ሁሉም ተናግረዋል። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ ጉተሬዥ ወደ 7 ሚሊዮን ሰው ይቅርታ ወደ ጋዜጣዊ መግለጫ እንመለስ። ጉተሬዥ እየሰጡ ናቸው።
Somalis that have suffered so much. We cannot see people go on dying because of bullets or dying because of hunger. We need to do everything to stop this conflict. We need to do everything for humanitarian aid to be distributed everywhere to everybody. We need to do everything for a dialogue to be established among Ethiopians to solve the problems in Ethiopia. Now, in this context, I was, of course, deeply shocked with the fact that 7 members of the UN had been expelled from Ethiopia and declared persona non grata. We had the occasion to explain why this, in our opinion, is not in line with international law. But on top of that, because so many accusations are appearing, today I asked the ambassador of Ethiopia to provide me with any copy of any written document given by the government of Ethiopia to any UN entity in relation to wrongdoings of any of these 7 members of the UN. And if such a document will be provided, we will, of course, immediately do an investigation why it did not come to my attention. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, we've never
never seen you do a right of reply ever in the Security Council that I can recall. Is this an expression of the level of your displeasure at the moment with the Ethiopian ambassador?
My duty to defend the honor of the United Nations.
የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ ከስብሰባው እንደወጡ ጋዜጠኞች ጥያቄ አቅርበውላቸው ነበረ። የኢትዮጵያ ሕዝብ ጉዳይ እንደሚያሳስባቸው ነው የተናገሩት። ለጋዜጠኞቹ ሰዎች በጥይትም ሆነ በረሃብ ሲሞቱ ማየት አንፈልግም ብለዋል። ሁሉንም ነገር ማድረግ እንፈልጋለን ለመርዳት ብለዋል። ኢትዮጵያውያን መፍትሄ እንዲፈልጉም ለማገዝ እንፈልጋለን ብለዋል። የሰባቱ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ባለስልጣናት መባረር እንዳስደነገጣቸው ገልጸው ቀደም ሲል እንደተከታተላችሁት የተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾችና አድማጮች አምባሳደሩ የተጻፈ መረጃ እንዲያቀርቡልኝ ጠይቀናል። እናም ይህ ሰነድ ከቀረበ ምርመራ እናደርጋለን ብለዋል። ወደ አብርሃም ደግሞ ላሸጋግራችሁ።
ተካተሉ ዘለዎም ክፍራት ሰማዕትና ባይቶ ጸጥታ ሕብረት ሃገራት ኣብ ንጉዳይ ኢትዮጵያ ምልክቱ ዝገብሮ ጸንሕ ዘተዩ እቲ ዘተ ሕጂ ተወዲኡሎ ኣብ ደገ ናይቲ ዘተ ዋና ጸሐፊ ሕብራት ሃገራት አንቶኒዮ ጉተሬስ ንጋዜጠኛታት ሓፂር መግለፂ ክህብ ጸኒሑ ንሱ ኣብ መግለፂኡ ሕብራት ሃገራት ካልእ ኣጀንዳ ይብሉን ኣጀንዳና ሓደ እዩ እሱ ከዓ ንህዝቢ ኢትዮጵያ ነቲ ሰላማዊ ህዝቢ ንምሕጋዝ እዩ ክብል ገሊጹ ኣሎ። ብጋዜጠኛታት ኣብ ዝመፀሉ ሕቶ ስለምንታይ ከም ዝመለሰን ስለምንታይ መልሲ ኣምባሳደር ኢትዮጵያ ከም ዝሃበ ብተሓተትሉ ንሕብራት ሃገራት ክከላኸሉ መሰለ እዩ ኢሉ ገሊጹ ኣሎ። መደብና ክቐጽል እዩ ናብ ፈቃድ ክሕልፈኩም።
Egaan daawwattootaa fi dhaggeeffattoota keenya kun kan isin darbaa jiru sagalee Ameerikaa irraa kan isin dabarsaa jirru walgahii mana maree mootummoota gamtoomaniiti. Walgahiin kun raawwateera. Barreessaan mootummoota gamtoomanii walgahii kanarraa akka bahaniini gaazexeessonni dhaabbatanii gaaffii gaafatanii turanii dhumma kanarratti isuma sila dubbatan dabalaniiti kan isaan haasa'anii keessumaa yaada ambaasaaddariin Itoophiyaa dhiyeessan irratti ragaan jiru kamiinuyyuu yoo jiraate yoo dheeffamee jedhe waan kanarratti hin hojjannaa qorannoo irratti goona jedhanii gaazexeessootaaf deebisanii akka waliigalaatti nu dhimma biraa hin qabnu dhimmi keenya dhimma saba Itoophiyaati kana gochuudhaaf immoo hin hojjannaa jedhaniiti kan yaada kennanii kanuma.
በነገራችን ላይ የተከበራችሁ አድማጮች በዚህ በተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ስብሰባ ላይ ንግግር ያደረጉት የዩናይትድ ስቴትስ ቋሚ ተጠሪ አምባሳደር ሊንዳ ቶማስ ግሪንፊልድ የመንግስታቱ ድርጅትን ጥረት ህይወትን ለማትረፍ እያደረጉ ያለውን አድንቀው የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት እነዚህን ሰባቱን የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት ባለስልጣናት ከሀገር ለማስወጣት የወሰደውን እርምጃ ግድ እርምጃ ብለውታል።
And I'll take a couple of questions.
Ambassador Thomas Greenfield ጋዜጣዊ መግለጫ እየሰጡ ናቸው። አሁን ወደዛው እንመለስ።
In fact, the strongest solidarity possible from the United States to the United Nations and its staff worldwide. We called for today's urgent meeting because of the Ethiopian government's reckless expulsion of 7 key UN officials, including the head of UNICEF, the head of the UN OCHA, and a senior official from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. These expulsions are an affront. They are an affront to the Council, they are an affront to the UN, and they are an affront to United Nations member states and our shared humanitarian principles. As I said in the meeting, there's simply no justification for these actions. The UN is impartial and neutral. These groups are conducting important human rights investigations and they are delivering life-saving aid. UN personnel must be allowed to return immediately to conduct their urgent work, including trying to stop a potentially devastating and unnecessary famine. These are self-inflicted wounds, and they reflect how more broadly this is a conflict where Ethiopians are killing Ethiopians, where Ethiopians are raping Ethiopians. It is Ethiopia's leaders who are letting down the Ethiopian people. 3 years ago, we were talking about Ethiopia as one of the fastest growing countries in Africa. a country full of promise and on the cusp of a major democratic and economic transformation. We were excited because Ethiopia looked like it might become the bedrock of Africa's optimistic future. 1 year ago, or a little less, we were told that the current situation would be a 2-week law enforcement action. Now we're talking about terrible violence. We're talking about mass famine, rape being used as a weapon of war. And I want to make something clear. It is not too late to stop this descent. It is not too late to prevent the famine, to get Ethiopia back on track, to save lives. There is still hope. We need a ceasefire that brings all parties to the table to find a peaceful way forward so that Ethiopians can return to the future we know it can have and its children deserve. The government needs to allow for the resumption of services to northern Ethiopia. There will be no lasting peace in Ethiopia, and the country's broader project of democratic and economic renewal will not be realized until there is a wider dialogue, one that includes all Ethiopians, on the future of that state. It is time for Ethiopian leaders to do the right things for the people of Ethiopia. Thank you. I will take a couple of questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambassador. Michelle Nichols from Reuters.
Hi, Michelle.
Given what we just heard in the Council from some of your colleagues, it doesn't look like any Council action is imminent. So what's the US planning to do? Are you going to impose sanctions soon on Ethiopia? And if I could, just on Afghanistan, we heard earlier from the Afghanistan director of WFP warning about the collapse of the Afghan economy if there's no sort of injection of cash. What is the US doing to try and kickstart the Afghan economy? Thanks.
Well, first on the question of Ethiopia, I think the fact of the council meeting today and speaking directly to the Ethiopians was an action. And believe me, it was not an action that was easy to take, but we were able to bring the council together in unity to speak about the situation in Ethiopia and have the Secretary General speak about the situation in Ethiopia. And we called upon the government to reverse its decision, and we called on the government to move forward on a ceasefire and look for a way forward. In terms of the United States, we do have tools at our disposal. You may have noted in my statement, I suggested it could be that we do a resolution, but also we, as you know, the President signed an executive order a couple of weeks ago that gives us the possibility of putting sanctions against individuals for gross violations of human rights and blocking of humanitarian assistance, and that is available for our use when we need it. On the situation in Ethiopia, it is not the US
አምባሳደር ሊንዳ ቶማስ ግሪንፊልድ በዚህ በመንግስታቱ ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ላይ ቀደም ሲል ካደረጉት ንግግር ጋር የሚደጋገፍ ወይም ያንን የሚያጠናክር ጋዜጣዊ መግለጫ ነው አሁን እየሰጡ ያሉት። በተለይ አሁን እንደሚናገሩት የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት ይሄንን ኃላፊነት የጎደለው ወይም ግዴለሽ ያሉትን የኢትዮጵያ እርምጃ በበጎ እንዳልተቀበለው ነው የተናገሩት። አምባሳደሯ የተባረሩትን ሰዎች መመለስ እንዳለባቸው መልእክት የሚያስተላልፍ ስብሰባ እንደሆነ ነው የተናገሩት። እንደውም አምባሳደሯ ይህ የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት እርምጃ በዚህ ምክር ቤት ላይ በአባል መንግስታት ላይ እንደዚሁም በተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የሰብአዊ ጉዳዮች አቅርቦት ላይ የተፈጸመ ድፍረት ጉዳት ነው ብለዋል። ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያለውን ሁኔታ ኢትዮጵያውያን በራሳቸው ላይ እያደረሱ ያሉት ጉዳት ነው፣ ቁስለት ነው እያሉ ነው ያሉት። ኢትዮጵያውያንን እየገደሉ ነው፣ ኢትዮጵያውያንን እየደፈሩ ነው ብለዋል። መሪዎቹንም ወንጅለዋል። የኢትዮጵያን ሕዝብ ትተውታል የሚል መልእክት ነው ያስተላለፉት። ከ3 ዓመት በፊት ኢትዮጵያ የአፍሪካ ተስፋ ሰጪ ዕጣ ትሆናለች ብለን ነበር። የዛሬ ዓመት አካባቢ ለ2 ሳምንት የተጀመረው ሕግ የማስከበር እርምጃ ተራዝሞ እስካሁን ድረስ ደረሱ ያሏቸውን ጉዳቶች ዘርዝረዋል።
As a UN Security Council member and a UN member state, we too want to see those allegations and to see where they're coming from. And the fact that you noted they are new allegations, they weren't even lodged prior to the 7 individuals being kicked out, raises some concerns in my mind about those.
ክቡራት ሰማዕትና አምባሳደር ሊንዳ ግሪንፊልድ ናይ ሕቡራት መንግስታት ኣሜሪካ መግለፂ ክትብፅንሓ ኣምባሳደር ሊንዳ ትርር ዝበለ መግለፂ ኣብ መጀመርያ ሂባ ነይራ። እዚ ዝተኻየደ ብኢትዮጵያ ዝተኻየደ ውሳኔ ውዕል ውሕድ ሕቡራት ሃገራት ዝፅሕፍስን ብቐጥታ ክቅየር ዘሎን ባህል እያ። ኣምባሳደር ሊንዳ ካብ ጋዜጠኛ ዝመፅእ ሕቶታት ነይሩ መደብና ኣብ ተኸታተሉና።
daawwattootaa fi dhaggeeffattoota keenya amma sagantaan keenyatti fufee jira. Amma immoo dhaabbata mootummoota gamtoomanitti bakka buutuun Yuunaayitid Isteetsi Ambaasaadder Lindaa Giriin Toomas walga'ii irraa ba'anii gaazexeessootaaf gaafatamanii turani. Walga'ii irratti maal jedhanii mootummaan Itoophiyaa tarkaanfii jara kan irratti fudhate namoota 7 irratti fudhate sababa kamiin iyyuu fudhatama hin qabu. Namoonni kun deebi'uu qabu. Yoo deebi'uu dhabaatan immoo tarkaanfii fuuldura duratti fudhatamuu qabu irratti itti yaaduu qabna jedhanii dubbataniiru. walga'ii sanarratti amma gaafa gadi ba'an nutis kanumatu gaafatame tarkaanfii maalii fudhachuu yaaddanii jennaani tarkaanfiin amma fudhatamuu hin jiru mootummaa Itoophiyaatii fi ergaa dabarsuudhumaaf barbaanne garuu ala darbee Baayiden gaafataniin tarkaanfii namoota tokko tokkotaaf fudhatamuu jiru sana inni ammayyuu fudhatamuu danda'a jedhaniiru. Isa ambaasaadder Taayyeen dhiyeessanii ragaa sanarratti immoo kanaan dura ragaan kun jiraachuu isaa wanti dubbatame hin jiru hin beeknu. Fuula duratti itti yaannaa jedhaniiru. Karaa kamiinuyyuu biyyatti deebisanii ijaaruudhaa fi biyyiin sun wal madeessaa wal ajjeessaa jiru kanarratti ammas hooggantoonni biyyattii sana ammallee carraa qabu waan sana sirreessuudhaa fi salphaadhaa waan danda'amuudha jedhanii dubbataniiru Liindaa Toomaas.
ክቡራትና ክቡራን አድማጮች ዝግጅታችንን ወደ ማጠናቀቁ ተቃርበናል። አሁን በነገው ምሽት ስርጭቶቻችን ዘርዘር ያሉ ዘገባዎችንና ትንታኔዎችን ይዘንላችሁ ለመቅረብ ጥረት እናደርጋለን። በነገራችን ላይ በዚህ ስብሰባ ላይ የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ የአየርላንድ ይቅርታ የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ዋና ጸሐፊ የአየርላንድ አምባሳደር እንደዚሁም የዩናይትድ ስቴትስ አምባሳደር በሀገሪቱ ውስጥ ያለውን ሁኔታ እጅግ አሳሳቢ እንደሆነ ነው እየገለጹ ያሉት። ሁኔታውን የዛሬ 10 ዓመት ሶማሊያ ውስጥ ከተፈጠረው ሁኔታ ጋር አመሳስለውታል። ነገር ግን ንግግር ያደረጉት በመጨረሻ ላይ የኢትዮጵያ አምባሳደር የስብሰባው መጠራት ያስደነገጣቸው መሆኑንና በዓለም አቀፍ ሕግ መሰረት ሀገሮች መብቶቻቸውን መጠቀም እንደሚችሉ ተናግረዋል። የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት ለውሳኔው ምንም አይነት ማብራሪያም ሆነ ማረጋገጫ የማቅረብ አንዳችም ግዴታ የለበትም ብለዋል። የተለያዩ ዓለም አቀፍ ሰነዶችን እያነሱ ተናግረዋል። አምባሳደር ታዬ አጽቀሥላሴ ማን ይገባል፣ ማን ይቆያል፣ ማን ይወጣል የሀገር መሰረታዊ ሉዓላዊ መብት ነው ብለዋል አምባሳደር ታዬ። እንዲሁም በኢትዮጵያ ላይ በመንግስቱ ላይ እየቀረቡ ያሉት ክሶችና ውንጀላዎች ሁሉ ከመካከላቸው ከተጠቀሱት የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት አምባሳደሮች ወይም የእርዳታ ሰራተኞችና ኃላፊዎች መካከል የተወሰኑት ድርጅቶችን በስም እየጠሩ የተሳተፉባቸው የፈጠራ ወይም የማጋነን ቁጥሮች የታከሉባቸው አድራጎቶች እንደሆኑ ገልጸዋል አምባሳደር። ክቡራትና ክቡራን አድማጮች ከዚህ ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ ስቱዲዮ ከትግርኛ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን አብርሃም ዘረ ከአፋን ኦሮሞ ዝግጅት ክፍላችን በፈቃዱ ሞረዳ እኔም የአማርኛው ዝግጅት ሶሎሞን አባተ ከተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታ ጥበቃ ምክር ቤት የኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ንግግር እስካሁን ድረስ እናስተላልፍላችሁ የቆየውን ቀጥታ ስርጭት በዚህ እናጠናቅቃለን። ጤና ይስጥልኝ። በደህና አምሹ።
ሰላም ለእናንተ ይሁን። ጋቢና ቪኦኤ ጀመረ። ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ ዛሬ ምሽት ከሚደመጡት መሰናዶዎች መካከል ዛሬ ኢትዮጵያ ለቀጣይ 5 ዓመታት የሚያገለግሏትን 22 ሚኒስትሮች ሹማለች። ይህን የተመለከተው ዘገባ በምሽቱ ይቀርባል። ሌሎች ርዕሰ ጉዳዮችም የተካተቱበትን መሰናዶ ሀብታሙ ስዩም እመራለሁ። ንጉሡ ታምሬ ደግሞ የድምፅና ምስል ምህንድስናውን ይከውናል። ከሁሉ በፊት አጫጭር የዓለም ዜናዎች ይሰማሉ። የደንገረ ነው።
አድማጮች በድጋሚ እንደምን አምሽታችኋል። የሕዝብ ተወካዮች ምክር ቤት በዛሬው ዕለት 6ኛ ዙር የአንደኛ ዓመት አንደኛ ልዩ ስብሰባውን ጀምሯል። ምክር ቤቱ የአስፈጻሚ አባላት ስልጣንና ተግባርን ለመወሰን በቀረበው ረቂቅ አዋጅ ላይ ሲመክርም መዋሉ ታውቋል። አድማጮች የዚህ ዜና ዝርዝር ከምሽቱ 3 ሰዓት ላይ በሚቀርበው የመጽሔት መርሃ ግብር ላይ ይጠብቁት። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የጸጥታው ምክር ቤት በኢትዮጵያ ጉዳይ ለመነጋገር ዛሬ እሮብ ይሰበሰባል። የጸጥታው ምክር ቤት ዋና ጸሐፊ የሆኑት አንቶኒዮ ጉቴሬሽ በዛሬው ዕለት በጉዳዩ ላይ ማብራሪያ ይሰጣሉ ተብሎም ይጠበቃል። ይህ ስብሰባ ኢትዮጵያ 7 የተባበሩት መንግስታት ከፍተኛ ባለስልጣናትን ከሀገሯ እንዲወጡ ካዘዘች በኋላ በ6 ቀናት ጊዜ ውስጥ ለሁለተኛ ጊዜ የሚደረግ ነው። የደቡብ ሱዳን መገናኛ ብዙሃን የመብት ቡድን ቁልፍ የሆኑ የሀገሪቱ የፓርላማ አባላት መገናኛ ብዙሃን በፓርላማ ወጪዎችና የአባላቱን ደሞዝ ጨምሮ ዘገባዎች ካቀረቡ ከፓርላማው አፈጉባኤ ፍቃድ ሳይጠየቅ የመገናኛ ብዙሃኑ ፍቃድ እንዲነጠቅ ሲሉ መናገራቸውን በጽኑ አወገዙ። የደቡብ ሱዳን የመረጃ ኮሚቴ ሊቀመንበር የሆኑት ፖል ዮኦኔ ቦንጁ የህግ አውጪዎቹ የገንዘብ ልውውጥን በተመለከተ ሪፖርት የሚያደርጉ ጋዜጠኞች ህጋዊ የሆነ አግባብ ካልተከተሉ እራሳቸውን ለአደጋ ያጋልጣሉ ሲሉ ተናግረዋል። ፖል ባለፈው ሳምንት ለመገናኛ ብዙሃን ባደረጉት ንግግር አንዳንድ ዘጋቢዎች ለቦታው አዲስ ናቸው፣ ስለዚህም ወደ ፓርላማው ብቅ ሲሉ ሊከተሏቸው ስለሚገቡ ደንቦች ልነግራቸው እወዳለሁ፣ ምክንያቱም ፓርላማ ማለት ህግ የሚተከበርበት ነው ሲሉ ተናግረዋል። የተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት የህፃናት ፈንድ ዩኒሴፍ በነዳጅ ዘይት ሀብታም በሆነችውና ግጭት በሚበዛባት በሰሜናዊቷ የሞዛምቢክ ግዛት ካቦ ዴልጋዶ ውስጥ እስላማዊ ጽንፈኞች ታዳጊ ህጻናትን ለጦርነት እየመለመሉ ነው ሲል ሪፖርት አደረገ። የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት የህፃናት ፈንድ በሞዛምቢክ በሚንቀሳቀሰው የአልሻባብ ቡድን ህጻናት በጉልበት ለውትድርና እየተመለመሉ እንደሆነ እጅግ ብዙ ጥቆማዎች ደርሰውኛል ብሏል። ዩኒሴፍ በስም ቢመሳሰሉም ከሶማሊያው አማጺ ጋር ምንም ግንኙነት የሌለው አልሻባብ ቡድን በተደጋጋሚ ህጻናትን ወንዶችና ሴቶችን ከቤተሰቦቻቸውና ከመንደራቸው መውሰዱንም ያስታወቀ ሲሆን ህጻናት ሴቶች እንደሚደፈሩና ጠላፊዎቻቸውን እንዲያገቡም በጉልበት እንደሚገደዱ አስታውቋል። ሂዩማን ራይትስ ዋች በቅርቡ እድሜያቸው እስከ 12 ዓመት የሚሆኑ ወንዶች ልጆች በካቦ ደልጋዶ ማዶ ባለ ቦታ ላይ ከአዋቂ ወንዶች ጋር በመቀላቀል የመንግስት ኃይሎችን እየተዋጉ እንዳሉም ተናግሯል። የመንግስታቱ ድርጅት የህጻናት ፈንድ ቃል አቀባይ ጄምስ ኤልደር ምንም እንኳን የተረጋገጠ አሃዝ ባይኖራቸውም በሺዎች የሚቆጠሩ ታዳጊ ልጆች መመልመላቸውን ግምት እንዳለ የተናገሩ ሲሆን አንዳንዶቹ ልጆች እንዲያመልጡ ቢደረጉም አማጽያኑ ጠላፊዎቻቸው ግን እስካሁን ድረስ ምንም አይነት ልጅ ለቀው እንደማያውቁ ተናግረዋል። የዩናይትድ ስቴትስ ፕሬዝዳንት ጆ ባይደን ትላንት ማክሰኞ በራሳቸው የህግ አውጪዎች ቅድሚያ የሚሰጣቸውን የመሰረተ ልማትና የማህበራዊ በጀትን በተመለከተ ቅስቀሳ ለማድረግ ወደ ሚቺጋን ተጉዘዋል። ሁለቱ ሂሳቦች በባይደን በራሳቸው ዴሞክራቲክ ኮንግረስ አባላት በመጠንና በይዘታቸው ላይ ውዝግብ ተነስቶባቸዋል። ፕሬዝዳንት ጆ ባይደን ማህበራዊ ደህንነትና መሰረተ ልማት ላይ መዋለ ንዋይን ማፍሰስ የምረጡኝ ቅስቀሳቸው ሁለት ቁልፍ ጉዳዮች እንደነበሩ የሚታወሱ ናቸው። አድማጮች ለምሽቱ ኩላቸው አጫጭር ዜናዎች እነዚህ ነበሩ። ከቀሪ የጋቢና ቪ መሰናዶች ጋር ታመሹ ዘንድ ጋብዛለሁ። ኤደን ገረመው ከዋሽንግተን ዲሲ።
ኤደን እናመሰግናለን። በመከታተል ላይ የምትገኙት ጋቢና ቪኦኤ ነው። ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ አብራችሁን ስለሆናችሁ በእጅጉ እናመሰግናለን። አሁን ወደ ቀዳሚው ዘገባ እንሻገር። ዛሬ ስድስተኛው የኢትዮጵያ የሕዝብ ተወካዮች ምክር ቤት አንደኛ ዓመት የሥራ ዘመን የመጀመሪያ ስብሰባ ተካሂዷል። ከያዛቸው አጀንዳዎች መካከል አንዱ ሀገሪቱን ለቀጣይ 5 ዓመታት የሚያገለግሉ ሚኒስትሮችን መምረጥ ነበረ። ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር አብይ አህመድ 22 ሚኒስትሮችን ምክር ቤቱ ያጸድቅላቸው ዘንድ በእጩነት አቅርበዋል። መስፈርታቸውንም አጋርተዋል።
እንደ መሰረታዊ መዘኛ ያየነው አንደኛ የፖለቲካ ልዩነት በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ አብሮ ካቢኔ ሆኖ በጋራ ምክር ቤት ውስጥ ተቀምጦ ሐሳብ ለመቀያየር የሚከለክል መሆን የለበትም። የተለያየ አመለካከት ያለን ቢሆንም ተቀራርበን መስራትን መለማመድ አለብን። እኛ መንግስት ለመስራት የሚያስችል ድምጽ ያገኘን ቢሆንም ሌሎቹን አካተን ብንሰራ ወደፊት አንድ ፓርቲ መንግስት መመስረት የማያስችለውን ድምጽ ቢያገኝ እንኳን ይህ ልምምድ ለዛ ግብአት ይሆናል፣ ፋውንዴሽን ይሆናል እና በተለመደው መንገድ መሄድ የለብንም የሚል አንድ መሰረታዊ ሐሳቤ ተወስዷል። ሁለተኛው በተቻለ መጠን የትውልድ ከባቢ ሰፋ ለማድረግ ጥረት ተደርጓል። በቂ አይደለም፣ አሁንም ሰፊ ስራ የሚጠይቅ ኤሪያ ነው፣ ግን ታሳቢ ለማድረግ ተሞክሯል። ሶስተኛ የሰዎቹን ልምድ እና የማድረግ አቅም ለማየት ተሞክሯል። አራተኛ ከጾታ አንጻር ቅድም ባነሳሁት እሳይ መሰረት በፈለግነው ልክ ባሄድም ማክሲመም የጾታንም ታሳቢ ለማድረግና ሴትም ወንድም የሚወከልበት ካቢኔ ለማድረግ ጥረት ተደርጓል። አራተኛ ብቃት፣ የኮታ ጉዳይ ብቻ ሳይሆን በብቃት ስራቸውን መከወን የሚያስችል ብቃት ያላቸው ሰዎች መሆናቸውን ለማረጋገጥ ጥረት ተደርጓል። አምስተኛ የሃይማኖት ስብጥርም የኢትዮጵያን መልክ እንዲይዝ ለማድረግ ጥረት ተደርጓል። ስድስተኛ የማገልገል ፍላጎት ያላቸው በስልጣንና በማገልገል መካከል ያለው ልዩነት ገብቷቸው ለማገልገል ኃላፊነት ለመውሰድ የሚሹ ሰዎች መሆናቸውን ለማረጋገጥ ጥረት ተደርጓል።
ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትሩ በእጩነት ያቀረቧቸው ግለሰቦች ቀጣዮቹ ናቸው። አቶ ደመቀ መኮንን ምክትል ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትርና የውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ ዑመር ሁሴን የግብርና ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ መላኩ አለበል የኢንዱስትሪ ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ ገብረ መስቀል ጫላ የንግድና ቀጠናዊ ትስስር ሚኒስትር፣ ኢንጂነር ታከለ ኡማ የማዕድን ሚኒስትር፣ አምባሳደር ናሴስ ጫሊ የቱሪዝም ሚኒስትር፣ ወይዘሮ ሙፈሪያት ካሚል የስራና ክህሎት ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ አህመድ ሽዴ የገንዘብ ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ ላቀ አያሌው የገቢዎች ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ፍጹም አሰፋ የፕላንና ልማት ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ በለጠ ሞላ የኢኖቬሽንና ቴክኖሎጂ ሚኒስትር፣ ወይዘሮ ዳግማዊት ሞገስ የትራንስፖርትና ሎጂስቲክ ሚኒስትር፣ ወይዘሮ ጫልቱ ሳኒ ኢብራሂም የከተማና መሰረተ ልማት ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ኢንጂነር ሀብታሙ ኢተፋ የውሃና ኢነርጂ ሚኒስትር፣ ኢንጂነር አይሻ መሐመድ የመስኖ ቆላማ አካባቢ ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ብርሃኑ ነጋ የትምህርት ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ሊያ ታደሰ የጤና ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ኤርጎጌ ተስፋዬ የሴቶችና ማህበራዊ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትር፣ አቶ ቀጀላ መርደሳ የባህልና ስፖርት ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር አብርሃም በላይ የመከላከያ ሚኒስትር፣ ዶክተር ጌዲዮን ጢሞቴዎስ የፍትህ ሚኒስትር እንዲሁም አቶ ብናልፍ አንዱዓለም የሰላም ሚኒስትር ናቸው። ምክር ቤቱ በሁለት ተቃውሞ በ12 ድምፅ ታቅበው እጩዎቹን አጽድቀዋል። በቀረቡት አንዳንድ እጩዎችና በተሰጣቸው ኃላፊነት ተገቢነት ላይ ያተኮሩ አስተያየቶች ከምክር ቤቱ አባላት ተሰምተዋል።
በኤዱኬሽን ከዛው የበቀሉ ሰዎች ያጣች አይመስለኝም እና እኔም ዶክተር ብርሃኑም እውነት ለመናገር ከአንድ ክፍለ ከተማ ነው የመጣ ነው። እኔ ምርጫ ክልል 19 ሲሆን እሳቸው ደግሞ 23 ናቸው። እንደገና ሰው ፈልጓል፣ ብልጽግና ነው። ኢዜማ እኮ ምናልባት ለፍትህ የቆምኩ ነኝ ብሎ ሚዛኑን ያስቀመጠው ምናልባት ወደ ፍትህም ቢሄድ አይደንቲቲውን ቢጠብቅ እኔ ምንም ተቋሙ የለኝም። ግን በዚህ አጋጣሚ እኔ በእውነት ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ብዙ አይዲያዎች አሉ። እኔ ቢሰጡኝ እድል ባወራዎት እኔ በጣም ደስ ይለኛል። እዚህ ላይ መጨረስ አልችልም፣ ግን ይሄ ታላቅ ተቋሙ በቃ እንደ ተቋሙ ይያዝልኝ።
አብይ አህመድ ለተነሱት ጥያቄዎችና አስተያየቶች ከሰጡት ምላሽ በጥቂቱ ቀንጭበን እንስማ።
አንድ የተከበሩ የምክር ቤት አባል ስለ ኤዱኬሽን ያነሱት ኤዱኬተር ነኝ ያሉት እና ስለ አቶ ብርሃኑ ያነሱት ያው እርሶ በሙያው እንደሚያውቁት ኤዱኬተር ማለት የትምህርት ሚኒስቴር ማለት አይደለም። ኤዱኬተር ማለት እውቀትን ኢንፎርሜሽን የሚሰጥ የሚያስተላልፍ ሰው እንጂ እውቀትን የሚያስተላልፉ ሰዎች ሰብስቦ ለአንድ ለተቀመጠለት ግብ ስኬት የሚመራ ማለት አይደለም። እንደዚያማ ከሆነ ማን ነው ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትርነት ተምሮ የመጣው? የለም እኮ ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትሩ የሆነ ኤሪያ ነው ያላቸው እውቀት እንጂ በሁሉም ነገር ላይ ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ለመሆን የሚያስችል ብቃት የላቸውም። በእናንተ ደግነትና መልካም ፍቃድ ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትር ቢሆኑ እና እርሶ እንዳሉት የትምህርት ስርዓቱ በእውቀት መመራት በጣም ትክክለኛ ሐሳብ ነው። ግን በኤዱኬተርስ አይደለም። ኤዱኬተርስ አስተምሩ፣ እናንተ እንድታስተምሩ የሚፈለገው እንጂ እንድትኖሩ አይፈለግም። አይፈለግም ማለት መሪ ከእናንተ አይወጣም ማለት ደግሞ አይደለም። ከእናንተም ውስጥ መሪዎች ሊወጡ ይችላሉ። መምራትንና ኤዱኬሽን አንድና አድርገን መውሰድ የለብንም።
በዛሬው የምክር ቤት ውሎ ቀርበው ከነበሩት አጀንዳዎች መካከል አንዱ የመንግስት አካላትን ስልጣንና ተግባር ለመወሰን የቀረበው ረቂቅ አዋጅ 1263/2014 ነው። በአንድ ድምፅ ታቅቦ በአብላጫ ድምፅ በተመሳሳይ ጸድቋል። ለአሜሪካ ድምፅ ሀብታሙ ስዩም። በመከታተል ላይ ያላችሁት ጋቢና ቪኦኤ ነው። ከአሜሪካ ድምፅ አብራችሁን ስለሆናችሁ በእጅጉ እናመሰግናለን። ወደ ቀጣዩ ዘገባ እንሻገር። እልልታ ፕሮዳክትስ ከ9 ዓመታት በፊት በአዲስ አበባ የተመሰረተ ተቋም ነው። ተቋሙ ከተፈጥሮ ግብዓቶች የሚዘጋጁ ሳሙናዎችን፣ የተለያዩ የአንገት ልብሶችንና ጌጣጌጦችን እያመረተ ለገበያ ያቀርባል። እነዚህ ምርቶችን የሚያዘጋጁት በሴተኛ ዳሪነት ይኖሩ የነበሩ ሴቶች ናቸው። ኤደን ገረመው ተቋሙ በሚሰጣቸው አገልግሎቶች ዙሪያ የተቋሙን ስራ አስኪያጅ ወይዘሮ እምነት መርሻን አነጋግራለች። ቀጥሎ ይቀርባል።
ወደ ሴተኛ ዳሪነት ያው ስወጣ ከአክስቴ ጋር ተጣልቼ ነው እና ብዙ ስቃይ ደርሶብኛል። ሱሶች አሉ፣ ጫት መቃም አለ፣ ሲጋራ ማጨስ አለ። አርግዤም ራሱ በጣም ብዙ ስቃይ፣ ህይወቱ በጣም ከባድ ነው። ያለኝ አማራጭ እሱ ብቻ ነበር። ከ3 ዓመት በኋላ ግን እልልታ የሚባል ድርጅት መጥቶ ወደ እነሱ ወሰዱኝ። እነሱ በጣም ረድተውኛል። ቤት ተከራይቼ እንድኖር ተደረግኩኝ። ትልቁ ነገር እኔ በህይወቴ አተረፍኩ የሚለው የበለጠ ነገር የልጄን ህይወት ነው። እኔ ስለተቀየርኩ ከኔ ጋር እስካለ ድረስ ልጁ ምንም አይነት ነገር ቅብዬ ያስባል።
ይህ በእልልታ ፕሮዳክትስ ውስጥ በጌጣጌጥ ስራ ላይ እየሰራች የምትገኘው የአየለች ድምጽ ነው። ተቋሙ ከተመሰረተ ከ9 ዓመት በላይ ጊዜን ያስቆጠረ ሲሆን በአዲስ አበባ፣ በአዳማ፣ በባህር ዳር ቅርንጫፎች አሉት። በተለያዩ ምክንያት ከቤታቸው ወጥተው በሴተኛ ዳርነት ህይወት ውስጥ ያሉ ሴቶችና እናቶችን የስራ እድል በመስጠት ይረዳል። የድርጅቱ ስራ አስኪያጅ እምነት መርሻ ስለ ተቋሙ እንቅስቃሴዎች እንዲህ ያስረዳሉ።
እልልታ ፕሮዳክትስ የተመሰረተው በ2012 ፈረንጆቹ አቆጣጠር ነው። የተመሰረተው እልልታ ዊመን አት ሪስክ የሚባል የሀገር በቀል ድርጅት አለ። እሱም ድርጅት ምን ላይ ነው የሚሰራው? ሴተኛ አዳሪ የሆኑ ሴቶችን ከዛ ህይወት በማውጣት ከማህበረሰቡ ጋር ተቀላቅለው እንዲኖሩ የሚሰራ ድርጅት ነው። ስለዚህ እልልታ ዊመን አት ሪስክ ስር የተለያዩ ፕሮግራሞች አሉ። በመጀመሪያ የምክር አገልግሎት ይኖራል። ከዛ ከምክር አገልግሎቱ ጋራ ተያይዞ ደግሞ የስራ ስልጠና ወይም የስራ ክህሎት እንዴት ወደው መስራት ይችላሉ የሚለው ነገር ላይ ስልጠና ይሰጣቸዋል። ከዛ በተጨማሪ ልጆቹ የሴቶቹ ልጆች ማለት ነው ብዙ ጊዜ ሴቷ ገላዋ ሲደክም ወይንም ደግሞ እሷ መስራት ስታቆም ይህን ስራ ልጇን የመተካት ነገር አለና ስለዚህ ያን ከትውልድ ወደ ትውልድ የሚሸጋገረውን ነገር ለመስበር ምንድነው እያደረግን ያለ ነው? ልጆቹ ላይ እየሰራን እንገኛለን። ከዴይኬር ጀምሮ እስከ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ድረስ ባለው እስከ ከፍተኛ የትምህርት እድል ድረስ እንሰጣቸዋለን። እዛ ፕሮግራም ውስጥ እስካለች ድረስ ልጇን ዴይኬር እንድትንከባከብ እናደርጋለን። ስለዚህ እዛ ትቀመጣለች ማለት ነው። ልጇ በመሀል ላይ እያጠባች ወይንም ደግሞ የሚያስፈልገውን ነገር እያደረገች ወደ ስልጠናዋ ትገባለች። ሌላው ደግሞ የምናደርገው ነገር የስራ ስልጠና በፍላጎታቸው በሚፈልጉት አይነት እንዲሰለጥኑ እናደርጋለን። የምግብ ስራ ሊሆን ይችላል። የልጆች እንክብካቤ ስልጠናዎች አሉ።
ባለፉት ጥቂት የማይባሉ አመታት ውስጥ ከ1000 በላይ የሚሆኑ ሴቶች ማሰልጠናቸውና ከዚህ ህይወት ውስጥ እንዲወጡ መርዳታቸውንም የእልልታ ስራ አስኪያጅ እምነት ይናገራሉ።
ከተለያዩ ድርጅቶች ጋር እንሰራለን። ከሃይማኖት ተቋማት ጋር፣ ሪሰንትሊ ከደላሎች ጋር፣ ከቀበሌዎች ጋር፣ ከማህበረሰቡ ጋር ገብተን የምንሰራበት ሁኔታ አለ። ስለዚህ እልልታ ዊመን አት ሪስክ በትንሹ ሰፊ ስራ ነው የሚሰራው። ግን ይሄንን ይመስላል የሚሰራው ስራ። እስካሁን ድረስ ወደ 1200 የሚያክሉ ሴቶች ሴቶችን ከዛ ህይወት የማውጣት ስራ ሰርተናል። ሰክሰስ ማለት ለኛ ሴቶቹ ሙሉ በሙሉ ከሴተኛ አዳሪነት ወይንም ከዝሙት አዳሪነት ሲወጡ ነው 90% ሰክሰስ አለን። ይሄ ሴቶቹን ካሰለጠነን በኋላ ቅድም እንደነገርኩሽ የበጎ አድራጎት ድርጅቱ ውስጥ ስራ ለማስቀጠር እንቸገራለን። ለምሳሌ ምግብ ስራ ተምራ ማንበብ አትችልም ሆቴል ውስጥ ለማስቀጠራት ስንል፣ ስለዚህ ቀለል የሚል ስራ ትምህርት የማይፈልግ ግን መስራት የሚችሉትን ስራ እናሰራቸው በሚል ነው። ስለዚህ አንደኛው ገቢ ማስገኛ ስራውን ይሰራል፣ መልሶ ሙሉ በሙሉ ገቢውን ለውመን አት ሪስክ ይሰጣል። ሁለተኛ ደግሞ የስራ እድል ከዛ ህይወት ለወጡ ሴቶች የስራ እድል ይፈጥራል ማለት ነው። ይሄ ነው የተቋቋመበት ዓላማ። ስለዚህ ፕሮዳክት የሚያመርተው ምርት ጌጣጌጥና ስካርፎችን ነው የሚያመርተው። ሳሙናም አለን።
በተጨማሪም በዚህ ህይወት ውስጥ የሚያልፉ ሴቶች በአብዛኛው ልጆቻቸው የስነ ልቦና ቀውስ እንደሚያጋጥማቸው በመግለጽ ለዚህም የተለያዩ መርሃ ግብሮችን እናካሂዳለን ይላሉ።
በብዛት በጣም ኤርሊ ኤጅ ላይ 3-4 ልጆች ይኖሯቸዋል። ያው ብዙ አባቶቻቸው የማይታወቁ ልጆች አሏቸው። ደግሞ ይሄ የማንነት ቀውስ ይገጥማቸዋል ብዙ ጊዜ ልጆቹ። በተጨማሪ እናቷ አቢዩዝ ስትደረግ ልጅም ታያለች፣ ወንድም ይሁን ሴት ያያሉ። አንዳንድ ጊዜ ይህንን ስራ የሚሰሩበት መንገድ በጣም ከባድ ነው። አንድ ቤት ውስጥ ከታች ወይ ልጅቷ ተኝታ ወይ ከአልጋ ስር ተኝታ እሷ ከላይ የምትተኛባቸው ሁኔታዎች አሉ።